The girl was 9 years old, and she walked into a room full of killers like she had nowhere left on earth to go. Her backpack was ripped at the seam. Her shoes were 2 sizes too big. And the words that came out of her mouth made 12 grown men stop breathing. My uncle says I owe him, and if Mom can't pay, I have to. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because every man in that room had survived war, prison, and the kind of darkness most people pretend doesn't exist. But none of them had ever heard a child say something that cold, that broken, that final. What happened next didn't just change her life. It Christ. It burned the whole thing down and rebuilt it from the ashes. If this story doesn't grip you by the throat in the next 10 minutes, I'll be shocked. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride this one together, because this one hits different. The clubhouse smelled like motor oil and yesterday's coffee, and the kind of silence that happens when men who've seen too much suddenly see something worse. Ronan Cross was standing behind the bar counter, not because he was pouring drinks, but because that's where he stood when he needed something solid between himself and the world. His hands were flat on the scarred wood. His coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago. The overhead light buzzed with the particular frequency of a fluorescent tube that should have been replaced 3 years back, casting everything in that sickly yellow that made even healthy men look like ghosts. He'd been president of the Iron Haven Motorcycle Club for 11 years, which meant he'd buried 4 brothers, talked 2 more out of eating their service pistols, and spent more nights sleeping on this bar floor than in any bed he'd ever owned. Former Army medic. 2 tours. The kind of medic who came home with steady hands and a head full of screaming that never quite stopped. He didn't talk about it. None of them did. The front door opened. It didn't bang open. It didn't swing with confidence. It crept. Slow. Uncertain. Like whoever was pushing it wasn't sure they had the right to exist on the other side. And then she was there. 9 years old. Maybe less. Brown hair that hadn't been washed in days, pulled into a ponytail that was coming apart. A purple backpack with a broken zipper, clutched against her chest like a shield. Shoes that were obviously someone else's shoes, the tongues flopping with every step. She stood in the doorway of a room filled with leather and engine grease and men covered in ink and scars, and she didn't flinch. That's what got Ronan first. Not what she said, not the way she looked. The fact that she didn't flinch, because kids who don't flinch in rooms full of dangerous men have already learned that flinching doesn't help. 12 members of the Iron Haven were scattered across the main room. Sawyer hunched over a parts catalog at the corner table, Briggs and Dutton playing cards near the window, the rest occupying various states of boredom and low conversation. Every single one of them went quiet when they saw her, not because a child walking into a motorcycle clubhouse was unusual, although it was, because of her eyes. She looked like someone who had already decided this was the last door she would ever knock on. Hey, Ronan's voice was careful, not soft. He didn't do soft, but careful, the way you talk to a wounded animal that might bolt or bite. You lost, kid? She shook her head. You looking for somebody? Another shake. Then what are you doing here? She took 2 steps forward, her shoes scraped against the concrete floor. The fluorescent light caught the bruise on her left wrist, old, yellowing, half hidden by the sleeve of a jacket too thin for November. My uncle says I owe him, she whispered. Her voice was so small it barely made it past her teeth. And if Mom can't pay, I have to. The room didn't just go silent. It went dead. Ronan's fingers curled against the bar top. Behind him he heard Sawyer's catalog hit the table, heard Briggs set down his cards without looking at them, heard the creak of Dutton's chair as the man leaned forward, hands going to his knees, jaw tightening. What's your name? Ronan asked. Lila. Lila what? Mercer. And where's your mom right now, Lila Mercer? The girl's chin dropped. She stared at the floor the way people stare at floors when they've run out of places to look. Home. But she doesn't know I'm here. She doesn't know She says we can't tell anyone. She says nobody can help. Ronan came around the bar, slowly. He pulled a stool away from the counter and sat down so he was at her eye level. He could see her more clearly now, the dark circles under her eyes, The way her fingers gripped the backpack strap so hard her knuckles were white. The slight tremble in her lower lip that she was fighting with everything she had. He'd seen that tremble before. On the faces of soldiers in field hospitals who refused to scream even though they were torn apart inside. On the faces of women in VIA waiting rooms who had given up expecting anyone to listen. "Lila," he said, and his voice was the only sound in the room. "Nobody in this building is going to hurt you. Nobody out there is going to touch you while you're in here. You understand?" She looked at him, searched his face. Whatever she found there, maybe the scars, maybe the ink, maybe the absolute absence of pity in his eyes, replaced by something harder, something that looked like a promise made by a man who had never broken one. She nodded. "Now tell me what your uncle wants." It came out in pieces. Broken pieces, the way truth always comes out of children who have been told too many times to keep quiet. Her father, Daniel Mercer, had died 14 months ago. Heart failure, the doctors said. He was 37. He'd been a contractor. Small jobs, residential, nothing fancy. He left behind Emma, his wife, and Lila, and a construction company that wasn't worth much, but wasn't worth nothing either. 3 weeks after the funeral, Victor Mercer showed up. Victor was Daniel's older brother. Lila had met him maybe twice in her entire life. Once at a holiday she couldn't remember clearly, once at the funeral where he stood at the back and didn't cry. He was tall. He wore suits that didn't fit the neighborhood. He smelled like cologne that made Lila's eyes water. And when he smiled at her mother, his teeth showed, but his eyes didn't move. He said Daniel had borrowed money from him. A lot of money. He said there were contracts. He said the debt transferred to Emma when Daniel died. He said if she couldn't pay, they'd have to work out an arrangement. Lila didn't know what arrangement meant, but she knew the way her mother's face looked when Victor said it, and she knew that face meant something worse than anything she could imagine. "How much money?" Ronan asked. "I don't know. Mom won't say the number. She just cries." "And your uncle, Victor, he comes to your house?" "He sends men first, then he comes after. He always comes after." "How often?" "Every week. Sometimes more." Ronan looked over Lila's head at Sawyer, who was already standing. Sawyer was the club's sergeant-at-arms, 6'4" and built like a man who'd spent his 20s throwing freight on loading docks, and his 30s throwing people who deserved it. He had a daughter Lila's age. His jaw was set so tight the muscles in his neck were visible. "She say where she lives?" Sawyer asked, his voice like gravel dragged across concrete. "Not yet." Ronan turned back to Lila. "Where do you live, kid?" "Ridgefield Terrace, Building C, Apartment 4. Every biker in the room knew Ridgefield Terrace. It was the kind of apartment complex that landlords abandoned and tenants couldn't escape. Peeling paint, broken locks, hallways that smelled like mildew and resignation. The Iron Haven had done toy runs there at the holidays. They'd fixed a single mother's car in that parking lot 2 winters ago when the temperature dropped to 15 and her engine block cracked. "And how did you know to come here?" Ronan asked. Lila's eyes flickered. For the first time since she'd walked in, something crossed her face that wasn't fear or exhaustion. It was something smaller, something fragile. "You fixed Mrs. Patterson's car," she said. "Last winter. She lives in Building A. She told my mom you were dangerous men who do good things." The girl paused. She said sometimes dangerous is what you need. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that changes rooms, that changes men. Ronan felt it move through the space behind him, felt Briggs shift his weight, felt Dutton's breathing change, felt the collective recalibration of 12 men who had spent years believing they were nothing more than outcasts with engines and leather and too many scars to count. Dangerous men who do good things. It wasn't a compliment. It was a prayer. "Sawyer," Ronan said without turning around, "get her something to eat, something warm." He stood up from the stool and walked to the window, pulling back the blinds with 2 fingers. The parking lot outside was empty except for their bikes and a rusted dumpster. November wind scraped across the asphalt, pushing dead leaves against the chain-link fence. "Briggs, I need you to pull whatever you can find on Victor Mercer. Business records, property filings, civil court, everything. On it. Dutton, get a car. Something clean, nothing with club plates. I want eyes on Ridgefield Terrace, Building C, tonight." "Done." Ronan let the blinds fall. He turned back to Lila, who was now sitting at the corner table while Sawyer moved through the back room, looking for something better than stale crackers and cold pizza. She looked impossibly small in that chair. Her backpack was on the table in front of her, and she was staring at it with the kind of focus that children develop when focusing on one object is the only way to keep from crying. He crossed the room and crouched beside her. Lila, I'm going to ask you one more question, and I need you to be honest with me. Can you do that? She nodded. Has your uncle ever hurt you? Physically? Has he ever put his hands on you? The pause lasted 3 seconds. It was the longest 3 seconds Ronan Cross had experienced since a mortar round landed 12 feet from his position in Helmand Province, and he counted the seconds before it either detonated or didn't. No, Lila said, then quieter. Not yet. But the men he sends, they grab my arms sometimes, and one of them told me that little girls who don't cooperate end up somewhere nobody finds them. Ronan stood. His face didn't change. His breathing didn't change. But something behind his eyes shifted, something that Sawyer recognized from across the room because he'd seen it exactly twice before. Once outside a bar in Reno when a man hit his girlfriend in the parking lot, and once in a hospital corridor when a father found out what a foster parent had done to his son. It wasn't anger. Anger was too small a word. It was the look of a man drawing a line in the dirt and daring the world to step across it. Sawyer. Yeah. She doesn't go home tonight. What about her mom? We go to the mom. Ronan pulled his jacket off the hook by the door, the leather worn soft at the elbows and scarred across the back, where the iron haven patch, a blacksmith's anvil wrapped in chain, had been stitched and restitched a dozen times. Briggs, you stay here with Lila. Nothing touches this building. Nothing. Briggs nodded once. He was already moving a chair to the front door. The ride to Ridgefield Terrace took 11 minutes. Ronan took the lead, Sawyer behind him, Dutton running parallel 2 blocks east in the car. The November air was sharp enough to cut, and the streetlights on Depot Avenue were half dead, throwing orange pools of light that made the road look like it was bleeding. Building C at Ridgefield Terrace looked exactly the way poverty looks when it stops trying to hide. The front door lock was broken. The stairwell light was out. The hallway smelled like cooking grease and something chemical, maybe cleaning fluid, maybe something being smoked in one of the units. Apartment 4 was at the end of the second-floor corridor, and the door had a deadbolt, a chain, and 3 separate scratches near the lock that told Ronan someone had tried to force it open at least once. He knocked 3 times. Solid, but not aggressive. Nothing. He knocked again. Emma Mercer. My name is Ronan Cross. Your daughter Lila came to see me tonight. She's safe. She's warm. But I need to talk to you. A long pause. Then the sound of the chain sliding, the deadbolt turning. The door opened 4 inches and a woman's face appeared in the gap. Pale, early 30s, dark hair pulled back hard against her skull, eyes that were red-rimmed and wide with a fear so deep it had become permanent. Where is she? Emma's voice cracked on the second word. Where is my daughter? She's at our clubhouse. She's eating. She's fine. Ronan kept his hands visible. He didn't step forward. She told us about your brother-in-law. The fear in Emma's eyes didn't diminish. It changed shape. It became something worse. The fear of someone who has been surviving by keeping a secret and who just realized the secret is out. You need to leave, she said. Please. You don't know what he'll do. He has people everywhere. He knows when someone comes to this building. He knows. Then he's going to know I was here. That's fine. Let him know. You don't understand. Ma'am. Ronan's voice was quiet, absolute. Your 9-year-old daughter walked alone through 6 blocks of this city in the dark to knock on the door of a motorcycle club because she believed we were the only people left who might help her. Now, I've been called a lot of things in my life, and most of them are probably true. But I have never once in my 43 years turned away a child who walked through that much darkness to find me. Emma stared at him. Her hand was shaking on the door chain. Behind her, the apartment was dark except for a single lamp, and Ronan could see the dishes piled in the sink, the eviction notices spread across the kitchen table, the blankets on the couch where someone had been sleeping because the bedroom door was closed and probably locked from the inside Because that's what you do when you're afraid someone is going to come through it in the middle of the night. She opened the door. The apartment was small and cold and stripped of anything that could be sold, which meant anything that could be sold already had been. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of a man in a hard hat standing next to a pickup truck, grinning the kind of grin that belonged to someone who didn't know his time was almost up. Daniel Mercer, the ghost in this room that nobody could escape. Emma sat on the edge of the couch. She didn't offer them chairs. She didn't offer coffee. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself and told them everything in a voice that was flat and exhausted and completely devoid of hope. Victor had first appeared 3 weeks after Daniel's funeral. He'd been polite, almost sympathetic. He said Daniel had borrowed $240,000 over several years to keep the construction company afloat. He had contracts, signatures, notarized documents. Everything looked real. Emma had never heard of any loans. Daniel had never mentioned his brother. But the paperwork was there, and Victor's attorney, a man named Holloway from a firm Emma couldn't afford to challenge, sent certified letters confirming the debt. When Emma went to legal aid, they told her the documents appeared legitimate and advised her to negotiate. When she went to the police, they told her it was a civil matter. When she called Daniel's former business partner, the man said he'd never heard of Victor and hung up. Then the intimidation started. First, the men. 2 of them, always in a dark sedan parked outside Building C. They never spoke to Emma directly at first. They just watched, sat there for hours. Sometimes they took photographs. Sometimes they followed Lila to school and back, staying half a block behind, close enough for Lila to know they were there. Then the phone calls. Blocked numbers. Victor's voice, calm and pleasant, explaining that he understood money was tight, but that debts didn't disappear just because someone died. Explaining that he was a patient man, but that patience had limits. Explaining that there were other ways to settle accounts if cash wasn't available. Then the workplace sabotage. Emma had been working as a receptionist at a dental office. Nothing glamorous, but steady, enough to keep the lights on. Anonymous complaints were filed with the practice, alleging that Emma had stolen medication from the supply room. She was terminated without investigation. When she applied for unemployment, the claim was denied because the termination was listed as cause-related. Then last month, someone had tried to force the apartment door. Emma had been inside with Lila. They'd heard the scratching at the lock, the rattle of the handle. It stopped after 5 minutes. The next morning, there was an envelope under the door containing a single sheet of paper with a number written on it, $240,000, and below it, in neat handwriting, "Time's up, Emma." "I have nothing left," Emma said. She wasn't crying. She was past crying. "I sold the furniture. I sold my rings. I sold Daniel's tools, every last one of them. And it's never enough. Victor doesn't want money. He wants—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "He wants to own us." Ronan sat across from her on a folding chair that creaked under his weight. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his face half in shadow from the single lamp. Sawyer stood near the window, watching the parking lot through the curtains, his phone already in his hand texting Dutton, who was circling the block. "These contracts," Ronan said. "You've seen them?" "I have copies. Victor's lawyer sent them." "Did Daniel ever sign anything in front of you? Any loan documents? Any agreements with his brother?" "Never. Daniel never even talked about Victor. I didn't even know he had a brother until the funeral." "And you told the police this?" Emma laughed. It was a small, broken sound, like a glass cracking from the inside. "The police told me they couldn't help with a family financial dispute. The detective gave me a pamphlet for mediation services." "Mediation?" She shook her head. "You can't mediate with someone who's threatening your child." Ronan looked at the photograph on the wall. Daniel Mercer, grinning next to his truck. A man who built things with his hands. A man whose brother was now dismantling everything he'd left behind piece by piece, using forged paper and manufactured fear. "Emma, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it." She looked up. "Those contracts are fake." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do. Because your husband never mentioned his brother to you. Because no legitimate lender sends men to follow a 9-year-old home from school. Because people who are owed real money go to court. They don't break locks and leave notes under doors." He paused. "Victor isn't collecting a debt. He's running a con. And you and Lila are the marks." Emma's face didn't change immediately, but something shifted in her posture, a straightening that was so slight it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't watching for it, like a beam in a collapsing building catching weight it wasn't sure it could hold. "Even if you're right," she said slowly, "what can you do? I can't afford a lawyer. I can't afford to fight him. I can't even afford to run." "You don't need to run," Ronan said. He stood up. "And you don't need a lawyer tonight. What you need tonight is to get your daughter and sleep somewhere with a locked door that nobody's tried to break. We can do that." He walked to the kitchen table and looked at the eviction notices. 3 of them, stacked neatly, each one more aggressive than the last. The landlord's name was printed at the bottom. Ronan recognized it, a property management company that owned half the low-income housing in the county and had been sued twice for negligent maintenance. "Sawyer." "Yeah." "Call Briggs. Tell him to set up the back room. 2 cots, clean sheets, the space heater. Lila's already there. Emma's coming." Sawyer was already dialing. "Miss Mercer." Ronan turned back to her. His voice had changed. It was no longer careful. It was certain. "I'm not going to promise you everything will be fine. I don't make promises I can't keep. But I will tell you this, whatever your brother-in-law is doing, he's doing it because he believes nobody is watching. That changes tonight." Emma stood. She looked at the photograph of Daniel one more time, then went to the closet and pulled out a small duffel bag that was already packed. She'd been ready to run for weeks. She just hadn't known where. The ride back to the clubhouse was quiet. Emma sat in the back of Dutton's sedan, holding the duffel bag in her lap, watching the streetlights pass through the window. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The engine hummed beneath her, and somewhere ahead, the sound of 2 motorcycles cutting through the November night echoed off the buildings like a drumbeat. At the clubhouse, Lila was asleep in Briggs's chair with a blanket over her shoulders and a half-eaten sandwich on the table in front of her. When Emma walked through the door, the girl didn't wake up. Emma crossed the room, knelt beside the chair, and pressed her forehead against her daughter's hair. She stayed like that for a long time. Nobody interrupted. Ronan stepped outside. The air was raw and metallic, the sky starless. He lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall, watching the empty road. His phone buzzed. Briggs had already pulled the first batch of records on Victor Mercer. 3 failed businesses in 4 states, 2 civil fraud lawsuits, both settled out of court with sealed terms. A restraining order filed by a former business partner in Ohio, later mysteriously withdrawn. A pattern that was invisible unless you were looking for it, and nobody had been looking for it because nobody had cared enough to look. Until a 9-year-old girl walked through a clubhouse door. Ronan exhaled smoke into the cold air and watched it disappear. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Dutton, who had circled back to Ridgefield Terrace after dropping Emma off. The message was 3 words. "Dark sedan. Watching." Ronan stared at the screen. The cigarette burned down between his fingers. Inside the clubhouse, a child slept in a chair, and her mother knelt beside her, and 12 men stood in various corners of a room that smelled like oil and coffee, waiting for the word of a man who had spent his whole life trying to save people he couldn't save in a desert 10,000 miles away. The sedan was still there. Victor's men. Watching an empty apartment, not yet knowing that the woman and the girl were gone, not yet knowing that the game had changed. But they would. Victor would find out by morning. And when he did, he wouldn't send men with cameras and blocked phone numbers. He'd send something worse. Ronan dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his boot. He didn't know yet what Victor Mercer really was. He didn't know about the construction company, the embezzlement, the journal hidden inside a heating vent. He didn't know that Daniel Mercer had died carrying a secret that could burn his brother's world to the ground. All he knew was that a little girl had walked through his door, and that the men watching her apartment were about to discover what happened when dangerous men decided to be good. The wind picked up. Somewhere across the city, a dark sedan sat in a parking lot, its engine idling, its headlights off. And inside it, a phone rang. The phone call came at 4:47 in the morning. Ronan was sitting in the main room of the clubhouse with his back against the wall and his boots on the floor and his eyes open because sleep was something that happened to other people. The space heater in the back room hummed through the thin walls, and somewhere behind the closed door, Emma and Lila were sleeping. Or at least lying still, which was as close to sleep as either of them probably got anymore. His phone vibrated against the table. Unknown number. He picked it up and said nothing. "Mr. Cross?" The voice on the other end was calm, measured, the kind of calm that came from a man who had practiced being calm the way other people practiced instruments, deliberately, for years, until the performance was indistinguishable from the real thing. "My name is Holloway. I represent Victor Mercer's interests." Ronan let the silence stretch. "It's come to my client's attention that his sister-in-law and niece are not at their residence. Mr. Mercer is concerned for their safety." "Is that right?" "He's a family man, Mr. Cross. He worries." "He worries." Ronan repeated it flat, the way you repeat something when you want the other person to hear how it sounds stripped of its costume. "Your client's niece walked 6 blocks through the dark by herself because she was so worried about your client's concern." A pause. When Holloway spoke again, the calm had thinned. Not by much, but enough for Ronan to hear the machinery underneath. "I'm going to advise you, respectfully, that this is a private family financial matter. Mr. Mercer has legal standing and documented agreements. Any interference from outside parties would be unfortunate." "You done?" "I'm simply—" "Here's what I heard, Mr. Holloway. I heard a lawyer calling a stranger at 5 in the morning to tell him that a woman and a child need to be returned to a location where they're being threatened. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that's not in any textbook I've ever seen." The line went dead. Ronan set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent tube above him had been replaced. Briggs had done it sometime around midnight while no one was paying attention, which was how Briggs operated, fixing things in the background like a man who'd been trained to keep the machinery running even when nobody asked. Victor Mercer knew within hours that Emma was gone. That meant surveillance tighter than 2 guys in a sedan. That meant eyes in the building, a neighbor, a maintenance worker, someone on Victor's payroll who reported movement and opened doors and asked no questions. The game was already wider than Ronan had assumed. He got up, poured coffee from the pot Sawyer had made at 3, and carried 2 mugs down the hallway to the workshop where Briggs was sitting in front of a laptop surrounded by printed pages and empty cigarette packs. "What do you have?" Briggs didn't look up. He was 51 years old and looked 60, with silver hair buzzed to stubble and hands that shook from a nerve condition he never talked about and reading glasses perched on the end of a nose that had been broken 4 times. Former Marine. Supply logistics. The kind of man who could trace a shipment through 11 countries and 3 shell companies without standing up from his chair. "Victor Mercer doesn't exist before 2009, Briggs said. Ronan set the coffee down. What do you mean?" "I mean the man's got a social security number, a driver's license, tax filings going back 15 years. But before 2009, there's nothing. No college records, no employment history, no address. It's clean, too clean." Briggs pulled off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Somebody built this identity like a house. Foundation first, walls second, paint last. It's beautiful work, actually, if you're not looking for the seams. So Victor Mercer might not be Victor Mercer. Victor Mercer might not be anybody." The implication settled into the room like smoke, slow, quiet, impossible to push out once it was there. A man with a manufactured identity claiming to be the brother of a dead contractor, claiming debts that may never have existed, targeting a widow and a 9-year-old girl. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a predator wearing a dead man's name. Ronan picked up his coffee and drank. It was burnt and bitter and exactly what he needed. "What about the lawyer? Holloway?" "Real. Licensed in the state. Small firm, 3 attorneys. Handles mostly debt collection and property disputes. Nothing flashy, nothing dirty. At least not on the surface. But he's filed 13 lawsuits in the last 4 years on behalf of Victor Mercer, all against individuals. Widows, elderly, people with no representation." Briggs looked up. "Every single one settled out of court. Sealed terms. No public record of the outcomes. 13. 13. Ronan set the mug down. His jaw worked, the muscle ticking beneath the scar that ran from his right ear to his chin. A souvenir from a piece of shrapnel that had missed his carotid artery by 1.5 centimeters, a fact that an army surgeon had told him with the cheerful nonchalance of a man who dealt in centimeters and half centimeters on a daily basis. 13 families. 13 targets. All of them alone, all of them grieving, all of them too poor or too frightened to fight back. Victor Mercer, or whoever he really was, hadn't chosen Emma randomly. He'd chosen her the way a hunter chooses a clearing, carefully, patiently, because he'd done it before and he knew exactly how the animal would move. "I want everything on those 13 cases," Ronan said. "Names, addresses, outcomes if you can find them. And I want to know who Victor was before he was Victor." Briggs nodded, then he hesitated. "What?" Ronan asked. "There's something else." Briggs turned the laptop around. On the screen was a county assessor's record, a property filing for a construction company called Mercer and Associates, registered to Daniel Mercer. Daniel's company. When he died, the company assets were supposed to transfer to Emma as next of kin. Standard succession. And? They didn't. 60 days after Daniel died, someone filed a transfer of ownership. Mercer and Associates was signed over to a holding company called Ashford Capital Group. Briggs tapped the screen. "Care to guess who owns Ashford Capital Group?" "Victor." "Victor." Ronan stood absolutely still. The coffee went cold in his hand. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the clubhouse walls groaned under it, the old building shifting and settling the way it always did, like a body adjusting to a wound. Victor hadn't just come for Emma's money, he'd already taken Daniel's company. The debt was never the point. The debt was the distraction, the mechanism by which Victor kept Emma terrified and compliant while he stripped the actual assets behind her back. By the time she realized what had happened, there would be nothing left. And Lila would be the leverage that kept Emma silent. "Wake Sawyer," Ronan said quietly. "Church. 1 hour." Church was what the Iron Haven called their closed meetings. Officers only, door locked, phones off, no exceptions. The room was at the back of the clubhouse, past the workshop and the storage closet full of transmission parts and winter gear. It was small and plain and smelled like leather and cigarette smoke and old wood, and the table at the center was scarred with decades of burns and gouges and the carved initials of men who were no longer alive. Ronan sat at the head, Sawyer on his left, Briggs on his right. Dutton, road captain, sat at the far end with his arms crossed and his face carved from the same granite as the rest of him. And at the corner, leaning against the wall because he refused to sit at a table where he hadn't been invited, stood Maddox. Maddox was the club's newest patched member, 34, former Army sniper, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. He'd been Iron Haven for 14 months, and he carried himself with the particular stillness of a man who had spent years watching the world through a scope and had never entirely stopped. He was smart, he was precise, and he didn't trust anyone, which was both his greatest asset and the thing that made every conversation with him feel like navigating a minefield. "Briggs ran it down," Ronan began. He laid out the facts, the manufactured identity, the 13 lawsuits, the stolen company, the lawyer at 5 in the morning. When he was done, the room was quiet for exactly as long as it took Sawyer to crack his knuckles, which was his way of saying he'd heard enough. "So we call the cops," Sawyer said. "Hand them Briggs's research. Let them do their job." "Emma went to the cops," Dutton said from the end of the table. "They gave her a pamphlet. She went to a precinct officer. That's not the same as dropping a fraud package on a detective's desk with documented evidence." "And what happens while the detective investigates? What's the timeline? 3 weeks? 3 months?" Meanwhile, Victor knows she's here. He knows she has help. He's going to move faster. Ronan tapped the table once. Every day that passes, he gets closer to locking down those sealed settlements and burying whatever trail he's left. If we hand this to the police now, with what we have, it's not enough. It's suggestive. It's not proof. Then what? Sawyer's voice had an edge to it. Not anger, not yet, but the sharpening of a man who had a daughter the same age as the girl sleeping in the back room and who needed the next step to be something concrete. "We keep her here indefinitely? We become a shelter now? We become whatever that girl needs us to become?" The words landed on the table like a fist. Sawyer leaned back in his chair and looked away, his jaw working. Dutton stared at his hands. Briggs cleaned his glasses with his shirt, which was what Briggs did when he wanted to say something but was waiting for permission. Then Maddox spoke. "I've got a problem with this." Every head turned. Maddox hadn't moved from the wall. His arms were crossed, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on Ronan with the flat, evaluating calm of a man who had spent years deciding whether to pull a trigger. You brought a civilian into the clubhouse, a child, without a vote, without discussion. And now you're telling us we're going to war with a man who has lawyers and resources and a network of people who've been doing this for years. He paused. Last time this club went to war for a civilian, we lost 2 brothers. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It had weight. It had history. 2 years ago, the Iron Haven had intervened in a domestic situation, a woman being beaten by her husband, who turned out to be connected to a regional drug operation. The club had gotten her out. They'd gotten her safe. And then 2 of their members, Porter and Vasquez, had been ambushed on a stretch of highway outside Branton, run off the road by a truck that was never identified. Porter died at the scene. Vasquez lasted 6 days in the ICU before his wife made the decision that he couldn't make himself. Every man in this room carried that weight. Every man in this room saw Porter's face in the dark when the lights went out. I'm not saying we don't help the girl, Maddox continued, his voice steady and flat. I'm saying we don't help her the way we helped the last one, because the last one cost us blood, and the people responsible never paid for it. Ronan looked at Maddox. He held the younger man's gaze without blinking, without moving, without the slightest shift in his posture. 2 veterans staring at each other across a table in a room that smelled like smoke and leather and ghosts. Porter and Vasquez, Ronan said, and the names landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. I carried both of them. I wrote the letters. I sat with Porter's mother for 3 hours while she screamed at me, and she was right to scream, and I took it because that's what you do when you're the reason someone's son doesn't come home. He stood, slowly. The chair scraped against the floor. You think I don't remember? You think there's a single night I don't see it? I see it every night, Maddox, every goddamn night, and I will carry it until the day they put me in the ground. His voice didn't rise. It dropped. But that little girl out there walked through the dark because she had nowhere else to go. And if I turn her away because I'm afraid of what it might cost us, then Porter and Vasquez died for nothing, because they died believing this club was the place that doesn't turn people away. Maddox didn't look away, but something moved behind his eyes. Not surrender, not agreement, but the acknowledgement of a truth he didn't want to accept but couldn't deny. I'm not saying turn her away, Maddox said, quieter now. I'm saying have a plan, a real one. Not just righteous anger and good intentions. Then help me make one. The words hung in the air. An invitation, a challenge, the kind of moment that defined what a brotherhood actually was. Not the patch or the leather or the sound of engines, but the willingness to stand in a room and argue about the right thing to do, and then do it anyway, even when every man present knew it might destroy them. Sawyer was the first to move. He put his hands flat on the table and leaned forward. Okay. Here's what I know. Victor's got a lawyer. He's got muscle. He's got a system that's worked 13 times, but he's never gone up against people who know how the system breaks. Briggs, Ronan said, I need 2 more days on the identity trace. If Victor Mercer isn't his real name, there's a trail somewhere. Name changes, court orders, something. Nobody builds a new identity without leaving fingerprints on the old one. Dutton. I'll keep surveillance on the apartment. If Victor's guys are still sitting on Building C, they don't know Emma's gone for good. That gives us time. But if they move, if they show up here, we need to be ready for that. Maddox. Maddox pushed off the wall. He uncrossed his arms. For the first time since the meeting started, something in his posture shifted. Not warmth, not enthusiasm, but engagement. The coiled readiness of a man who had agreed to fight and was now calculating angles. The lawyer, Holloway. He's the weak point. 13 sealed settlements means 13 clients who might talk if someone gives them a reason. Find me one. Just one who's angry enough. Ronan nodded. He looked around the table. 4 men. Each one broken in ways that didn't show from the outside. Each one willing to stand between a 9-year-old girl and something they didn't fully understand yet. That was enough. It had to be. Church is over, he said. Nobody talks to Emma about what we found, not yet. She's scared enough. Let her sleep. They filed out. Sawyer first, then Dutton, then Briggs. Maddox was last, and as he passed Ronan in the doorway, he stopped. For what it's worth, Maddox said without looking at him. Porter would have voted yes. Then he was gone. Ronan stood alone in the room. He put his hands on the table and bowed his head and breathed. The wood was cold under his palms. The silence was complete. Then he went back to work. The next 36 hours moved with the slow, grinding momentum of a machine being assembled in the dark. Briggs dug deeper into Victor Mercer's history and found a crack, a bankruptcy filing in Pennsylvania from 2007 under a different name. The filing listed a man named Gregory Allen Stokes, age 42 at the time, who had systematically defrauded 3 elderly homeowners by convincing them he was managing their estates. Stokes had disappeared before the hearing. The case was abandoned. The photograph attached to the filing was grainy, taken from a driver's license. But the face was unmistakable. Victor Mercer was Gregory Stokes, and Gregory Stokes was a professional predator who had been running the same con for nearly 20 years. Meanwhile, Dutton reported from Ridgefield Terrace. The dark sedan was gone, replaced by a newer model, silver, tinted windows, different plates. Victor's people had rotated their surveillance, which meant they were organized, which meant they'd done this before. But they were still watching an empty apartment, still waiting for Emma to come home. She wasn't coming home. Emma spent the first day at the clubhouse in a state of frozen stillness, barely speaking, barely eating, sitting in the corner of the back room while Lila drew pictures on scrap paper that Briggs had found in the workshop. The pictures were of motorcycles and houses and a man in a hard hat who was smiling, and when Sawyer saw them, he had to leave the room and stand in the hallway for a full minute with his hand over his face. On the second day, Emma found Ronan in the main room. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was steadier than before. Not strong, but steady, the way a person's voice gets when they've made a decision and are carrying the weight of it. "Sit down." She sat across from him. Her hands were on the table, palms down, fingers spread, as if she was physically holding herself in place. "Before Daniel died," she said, "he was acting different, distracted, working late, coming home and not talking. I assumed he was having problems with the business. Money problems. Maybe worse." She paused. "I didn't ask. I should have asked, but I was afraid of what the answer might be." Ronan waited. "The last week before he died, he told me something strange. He said, 'If anything happens to me, don't let anyone into the apartment, especially not my brother.' I didn't even know he had a brother. I thought he was being dramatic. I thought—" Her voice cracked. She pressed her palms harder against the table. "I thought he was just stressed." "What else did he say?" "He said there was something important in the apartment, something he needed to give to someone, but he wasn't ready yet. He didn't say what it was. He didn't say where." Emma looked at Ronan, and her eyes held the particular agony of a person who had been given a clue and failed to follow it. "After he died, I looked everywhere. Every drawer, every closet, every box. I never found anything." Ronan leaned back. His mind was moving fast now, turning pieces, fitting edges. Daniel Mercer had known about his brother, about the embezzlement, about the con. He'd been gathering evidence. He'd hidden it somewhere in the apartment. And then he died, and the evidence had stayed hidden while Victor moved in and began his work. The answer was in that apartment. Whatever Daniel had left behind, documents, recordings, proof, it was still there, buried somewhere Emma hadn't thought to look. "Emma, I need to get into your apartment." Her face went white. "Victor's men are watching it." "I know. If they see you, they won't. You don't know what he'll do. Emma." Ronan's voice was steady, not gentle, steady. "Your husband hid something in that apartment because he knew his brother was a thief. He died before he could use it. But it's still there. And if I can find it, Victor Mercer, or whatever his real name is, goes to prison. Not next year, not after a lawsuit. He goes to prison and he never touches you or Lila again." Emma stared at him. Her breathing was shallow. The lamp cast half her face in light and half in shadow, and in that moment she looked like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether the person holding out a hand was someone she could trust or someone who would let go. "His real name?" she whispered. "We have reason to believe Victor isn't who he says he is. that this isn't the first time he's done this. The color drained from Emma's face entirely. She sat there, bloodless and still, and Ronan could see the exact moment when the full scope of what had been done to her family became real. Not a family dispute, not a debt, but a professional operation designed to consume everything her husband had built and leave nothing but silence behind. "Go," she said. The word was barely audible. "Find whatever Daniel left." Ronan stood and pulled his jacket from the hook. The leather creaked as he shrugged it on, heavy and familiar, carrying the smell of engine oil and cold air and years of riding toward things that most people rode away from. He found Sawyer in the workshop. "I need to get inside Ridgefield Terrace, Building C, Apartment 4, tonight." Sawyer looked at him. "You know they're watching." "Dutton says they rotate at midnight. Silver sedan leaves, takes about 20 minutes before the next car shows. That's our window." "Our?" "Mine. I go alone." "The hell you do." "One man moves quieter than two, and if I'm wrong about the rotation and someone's still there, one man doesn't look like a crew. One man looks like a resident. I go in through the east stairwell, I'm in the apartment in 3 minutes, and I'm out before anyone knows I was there." Sawyer stared at him for a long time. The workshop light was harsh overhead, throwing deep shadows under Sawyer's brow, making his eyes look like holes cut in stone. His hands were resting on a dismantled carburetor, grease blackening his fingers, and he didn't move them. "If something happens to you in there," Sawyer said, "I've got a little girl in the back room who walked through the dark because she thought we could save her, and I've got to tell her we can't. Nothing's going to happen." That's what Porter said. The name hung between them like a blade. Ronan felt it in his chest. The old wound, the one that never healed, the one he carried alongside the shrapnel scar, and the nightmares, and the 4 a.m. silences when the world was still and the ghosts were not. "I know," Ronan said. "That's why I'm going alone." He left at 11:40, riding without headlights for the last 3 blocks, the engine a low rumble that he killed 2 streets from the complex. He walked the rest of the way in darkness, his boots silent on the wet asphalt, his breath visible in the cold. The silver sedan was parked in its usual spot near the dumpster. One occupant, driver's seat, phone glowing blue against his face. At 12:01, the sedan pulled out. Ronan counted to 60, then he moved. The east stairwell door was unlocked. Broken lock, same as the front, same as every door in this building that the management company had stopped maintaining years ago. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his hand trailing the railing, his breathing controlled. Second floor, hallway empty. The overhead light flickered, casting a strobe effect that made the corridor look like a crime scene photograph. Apartment 4. The door was locked, but Emma had given him her key. He turned it, stepped inside, and closed the door behind him without a sound. The apartment was exactly as they'd left it. Eviction notices on the table, dishes in the sink, the photograph of Daniel on the wall, grinning at a future he would never see. Daniel had said he'd hidden something important. Emma had searched every drawer, every closet, every box. But she'd been searching like a civilian, looking in places where people normally hide things. Ronan wasn't a civilian. He was a man who'd spent years in field hospitals and forward operating bases, where hiding things meant the difference between life and death, where you didn't put valuable items in drawers or closets because those were the first places anyone looked. You put them where nobody would ever think to look unless they'd been trained to. He started with the walls, knocked softly, listening for hollow spaces. Kitchen first, then the hallway, then the bedroom. Nothing. Bathroom? Nothing. He moved to the floors, pressing his boot against the edges of the linoleum in the kitchen, checking for loose tiles. Nothing. Then he went to the heating system. The apartment had old-style baseboard heating with wall vents, metal grates bolted into the drywall, most of them painted over so many times they were practically sealed. He started in the living room. The first vent was solid. The second was solid. The third, in the hallway between the bedroom and the bathroom, had a screw that was slightly lighter than the others, not painted over. Recently removed and replaced. Ronan pulled a multi-tool from his jacket and unscrewed the grate. It came off with a soft metallic protest. He reached inside the vent, past the dust and the cold air, and his fingers touched metal. A box. Small, rectangular, heavy for its size. He pulled it out and held it under the hallway light. A lockbox, the kind sold at office supply stores, matte gray, with a simple combination lock. 3 digits. He tried the obvious. Lila's birthday, Emma's birthday, Daniel's birthday. Nothing worked. He stared at the box. Then he looked at the photograph of Daniel on the wall. The man in the hard hat. The grinning contractor. The hard hat had a number stenciled on the side. A job site number, barely visible in the photograph. Ronan crossed the room and held the picture under the lamp. 714. He went back to the box. Turned the dials. 714. The lock clicked open. Inside the box there were 3 items. A leather-bound journal, worn at the edges, filled with Daniel Mercer's handwriting. A thick envelope labeled Evidence Do Not Destroy in block letters. And a sealed white envelope, smaller, with a single line written on the front in Daniel's hand. For Emma, if something happens to me. Ronan held the sealed envelope and stared at it. His hands were steady. His breathing was steady. But something inside his chest was not steady at all, because he was holding a dead man's last words to his wife, and the weight of that was heavier than anything he'd carried out of any war. He opened the journal first. The handwriting was messy, urgent, written by a man who was running out of time and knew it. The first entry was dated 11 months before Daniel's death, and the first line read, "His real name is Gregory Stokes. He's not my brother. He was never my brother. And he's going to destroy everything I've built unless I stop him." Ronan closed the journal. He put everything back in the box. He tucked the box inside his jacket, pressing it flat against his ribs. Then he heard the footsteps. Not from outside the apartment, from inside the building, coming up the east stairwell. 2 sets, moving fast, moving with purpose, and they were not trying to be quiet. Ronan killed the hallway light and moved to the window. The parking lot below was empty. No sedan, no vehicle at all, which meant they hadn't come from the surveillance car. They'd come from inside the building. Victor had people in the building, not watching from outside, living here, embedded. A neighbor, a tenant on Victor's payroll, someone who had seen Ronan enter and made a call. The footsteps reached the 2nd floor. Ronan stood in the dark apartment with a dead man's secrets pressed against his chest, and 2 men walking toward the only door between him and the hallway, and he understood, with the absolute clarity of a man who had been in exactly this kind of situation before, in a different country, in a different life, that whatever happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether a 9-year-old girl ever got her future back. The doorknob turned. The doorknob turned halfway and stopped. Ronan didn't breathe. He was standing 3 feet from the door with his back flat against the wall beside the hinges, the lockbox pressed against his ribs under his jacket, his right hand wrapped around the multi-tool with the blade extended. Not because a 3-inch blade would stop 2 men, but because it was the only thing between him and nothing. The hallway light was out. He'd killed the apartment light. The only illumination came from the parking lot below, a thin orange stripe leaking through the window blinds and cutting across the floor like a scar. A voice on the other side of the door, low, male, not whispering, murmuring, the way men murmur when they're deciding something and don't want to be heard deciding it. Then a second voice, deeper, impatient. "Just open it. Key doesn't work. She changed the lock." "She didn't change anything. Push it." A shoulder hit the door. The deadbolt held. Another hit. The frame groaned but didn't give. Ronan felt the vibration travel through the wall and into his spine, and he calculated. 3 seconds to cross the apartment to the bedroom window, 4-foot drop to the fire escape, 8 seconds down the ladder to the alley. If the fire escape held. If there wasn't someone waiting below. The 3rd hit cracked the frame. Ronan moved. He crossed the living room in 4 strides, grabbed the bedroom window latch, and wrenched it upward. The window hadn't been opened in months, and it screamed against the track. A high metallic shriek that cut through the darkness like an alarm. Behind him, the front door crashed inward and hit the wall, and 2 sets of boots hammered across the threshold. He was through the window before they reached the hallway. The fire escape was rusted and wet from the night air, the metal grating biting into his palms as he swung over the railing and dropped to the ladder. 1 flight. His boots hit the rungs hard, each impact sending a shock up through his knees. He could hear shouting above him, confused, angry, one of them at the window looking down. He hit the alley pavement and ran. Not toward his bike. His bike was parked 2 streets east, and these men would hear a Harley from 6 blocks away. He ran west, into the maze of dumpsters and chain-link fences and narrow passages between buildings that made up the back arteries of Ridgefield Terrace, his breath tearing at his throat, the lockbox shifting against his ribs with every stride. He ran for 4 blocks before he stopped, an alcove behind a laundromat. The dryer vents were pushing warm, humid air into the alley, and the steam mixed with the cold November night to create a thin fog that hung at knee level. Ronan pressed his back against the brick wall and breathed. His heart was hammering. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, the old familiar cocktail that he hadn't tasted in years, but that his body remembered the way it remembered everything from the war, instantly, completely, without mercy. He pulled out his phone and called Dutton. "Where are you?" 4 blocks west of the complex, East Alley behind the laundromat on Greer Street. "I'll be there in 6 minutes. Make it 4. He hung up and looked at the sky. No stars, no moon, just the flat gray ceiling of cloud cover that pressed down on the city like a hand. He had what he needed. Daniel's journal, the evidence envelope, the sealed letter to Emma. Everything that proved Victor Mercer was Gregory Stokes, that the debts were fabricated, that a dead man had tried to protect his family from beyond the limits of his own heartbeat, but Victor's men had been inside the building, not outside. Inside. Which meant Victor's network was deeper than surveillance cars and threatening phone calls. It meant he had people embedded in the infrastructure of his targets' lives, neighbors, building staff, maybe even social workers or city employees. The kind of network that didn't just appear overnight, the kind that took years to build. 13 families. How many of them had lived in buildings where the man next door worked for Victor? How many of them had been watched from inches away, not miles? Dutton's sedan appeared at the end of the alley, headlights off. Ronan climbed in without a word, and they drove back to the clubhouse in silence. It was 1:47 in the morning when Ronan set the lockbox on the table in the workshop and opened it under the harsh fluorescent light. Briggs was already there, his glasses on, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold 2 hours ago. Sawyer stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it did when he was fighting the urge to say something that wouldn't help. 2 men, Ronan said before anyone could ask. They had a key. It didn't work because Emma's lock was changed at some point, but they had one. And they came from inside the building, not outside. Tenants, Briggs asked, or someone with access, maintenance, management, someone Victor put in place. Ronan opened the journal and set it on the table. Daniel Mercer knew everything. He knew Victor wasn't his brother. He knew the real name. He spent almost a year documenting it. Briggs leaned forward and began reading. His eyes moved across Daniel's handwriting with the focused intensity of a man who had spent decades reading supply manifests and shipping invoices and could process written information faster than most people could speak it. After 3 minutes, he took off his glasses and set them on the table. "This isn't a journal," Briggs said. "This is a case file. Dates, amounts, transaction records, names. Daniel traced every dollar Victor, Stokes, stole from the construction company. He mapped the shell companies. He identified the bank accounts." Briggs looked up. "And he names an accomplice." The word landed in the room like a grenade that hadn't detonated yet. "Who?" Ronan asked. Briggs turned the journal to a page near the end. Daniel's handwriting was more erratic here. The letters tighter, the pen pressure heavier, the ink smudged in places as though his hand had been sweating. There was a name circled 3 times. Tom Kinney. Sawyer's arms dropped to his sides. The room went cold. Tom Kinney was the Iron Haven's former treasurer. He'd been a member for 9 years. Reliable, quiet, the kind of man who showed up to every meeting and paid his dues and fixed things when they broke and never asked for recognition. He'd left the club 18 months ago, citing personal reasons. A divorce. Financial trouble. The usual collapse that happened to men who came back from war and found out that peacetime was harder than combat. He'd moved to the eastern part of the county, stopped answering calls, and disappeared into the particular kind of silence that the club had learned to respect because pushing against it usually made things worse. Nobody had questioned it. Nobody had thought to. "Tom Kinney," Sawyer repeated. His voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a man who was frustrated or cautious. It was the voice of a man who had just been punched in the stomach and was still trying to stand. "Our Tom Kinney." Daniel's journal says Kinney handled the financial routing for Stokes's shell companies. He was the one who processed the fraudulent transfers from the construction company. He was paid a percentage. Briggs paused. According to Daniel, Kinney was also the one who provided access to the financial records of at least 3 of the 13 victims. "How?" Ronan asked. "Through the club." The silence that followed was absolute, not the productive silence of men thinking, the devastated silence of men who had just learned that the foundation they were standing on had a crack running through it. The Iron Haven did community work, toy runs, charity rides, car repairs for single mothers, holiday meals at the community center, and through that work they had access, limited, informal, but real, to the lives of the people they helped. Names, addresses, family situations, financial hardships. The exact kind of information that a man like Gregory Stokes would need to identify his next target. Tom Kinney had been inside the club. He'd seen the families they helped, he'd heard the stories, and he'd fed that information to a predator who used it to destroy them. Ronan braced both hands on the table. His head dropped. His shoulders rose. He stood there for 10 seconds without moving, and the men in the room watched him the way you watch a building when you hear the first structural groan that tells you the whole thing is about to come down. "How many?" Ronan said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "How many of those 13 families came through us?" Briggs didn't answer immediately. He turned back to the journal, scanning pages, cross-referencing the names Daniel had listed with the ones he'd already pulled from court records. After a full minute, he looked up. At least 4, maybe 5. Widows and elderly individuals the club had done outreach for, people who trusted us. Sawyer slammed his fist into the doorframe. The sound cracked through the workshop like a gunshot. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The rage was physical. It was in the white of his knuckles, the tremor in his forearm, the veins standing out in his neck like cables under tension. "We led them to the wolves," Sawyer said through his teeth. This club, we brought those families food and fixed their cars and told them they were safe, and the whole time our own man was selling them to that piece of—" "Sawyer," Ronan's voice was flat, dead, controlled with the kind of control that costs a man something vital to maintain. "Not now." "When then? When do we deal with the fact that our brother, our patched member, helped a con man destroy the same people we swore to protect? We deal with it after we deal with Victor, after we deal with Stokes. Because right now, this second, that man still has a lawyer and a network and people inside buildings watching apartments, and if he finds out we have Daniel's evidence before we're ready to use it, he will burn everything and disappear the way he disappeared from Pennsylvania, and the next family he targets won't have anyone walking through their door." Sawyer stared at him. Then he turned and walked out of the workshop. His boots hit the hallway floor like hammer strikes, each one carrying the weight of a man who had just discovered that betrayal didn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it came from the men who sat beside you at your own table. Ronan picked up the sealed envelope. "For Emma. If something happens to me." He turned it over in his hands. The paper was slightly yellowed, the seal still intact. Daniel had written this knowing he might not survive, knowing that the man he was investigating might reach him first. And then Daniel had died of heart failure at 37. Ronan stared at the envelope. His mind was pulling at something, a thread he didn't want to pull because he knew where it led. Heart failure. A healthy 37-year-old contractor. No history of cardiac problems. Emma had said so. No warning signs. Just gone. One morning he was alive, and by evening he wasn't, and the doctor said these things happen. And everyone accepted it because what else do you do when a doctor tells you something and there's no reason not to believe them? But there was a reason now. Ronan opened the journal to the last entry. Daniel's handwriting was almost illegible here, the words cramped and rushed, written by a man who was afraid. The entry was dated 4 days before his death. "He knows. Stokes knows I have the records. Kinney must have told him. I'm getting sick. Stomach problems, headaches, dizzy spells. Started 2 weeks ago. Emma thinks it's stress. Maybe it is. But Stokes sent a man to the job site yesterday. Didn't say anything. Just watched me work. Stood there for an hour and watched. I need to get the evidence to someone. I need to do it soon. I'm running out of time, and I don't know if that's a feeling or a fact. Running out of time. Ronan closed the journal. He set it on the table and pressed his palms flat against the cover and stood there, breathing, while the fluorescent light hummed above him and the heater rattled in the back room where a widow and her daughter were sleeping. Daniel Mercer hadn't died of heart failure. Daniel Mercer had been killed, slowly, carefully, by a man who knew how to make murder look like nature. And Tom Kinney, the club's own brother, had been the one who told Stokes that Daniel was getting close. The realization moved through Ronan's body like a cold current, settling in his gut, hardening into something that was beyond anger and beyond grief and beyond any emotion he had a name for. It was the feeling of standing on ground that had been solid your entire life and realizing it was hollow, that the brotherhood you'd built, the patch, the table, the code, had been compromised from the inside by a man who ate your food and shook your hand and called you brother, while feeding a predator information that got people destroyed, that maybe got a man killed. He picked up his phone. It was 2:23 in the morning. He dialed a number he hadn't called in 18 months. It rang 4 times. Yeah. Tom Kinney's voice was thick with sleep and something else. A wariness, the immediate tension of a man who gets a call in the middle of the night and knows before the first word is spoken that the call is about the thing he's been hiding from. Tom? A pause. Ronan. We need to talk. It's 2 in the morning. I'm aware of the time. Another pause. Longer. Ronan could hear breathing on the other end. Not sleep breathing, not calm breathing, but the shallow, rapid intake of a man whose body had just dumped adrenaline into his bloodstream. What's this about? Gregory Stokes. The silence that followed was the longest Ronan had ever endured on a phone call. It lasted 8 seconds. He counted. In those 8 seconds, he heard everything he needed to hear. Not in words, but in their absence. The absence of confusion. The absence of who. The absence of a man hearing an unfamiliar name and responding the way a person responds to an unfamiliar name. Tom Kinney heard the name Gregory Stokes and went silent because the name was not unfamiliar. Because the name was the one name in the world he had been praying no one would ever say to him. I don't know what you're... Don't. Ronan's voice was quiet. Lethally quiet. The kind of quiet that men who had served with him recognized as the moment just before everything changed. Don't lie to me, Tom. Not tonight. Not after what I found. What did you find? Daniel Mercer's journal. The breathing on the other end stopped entirely. For 3 seconds, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no life. Then a sound that Ronan didn't expect. A sound that rewired his entire understanding of the man on the other end of the line. Tom Kinney was crying. Not the kind of crying that men do when they're caught, not the tears of self-pity or fear. It was the ragged, broken sound of a man who had been carrying something for years that was too heavy for any human being to carry, and who had just heard the sound of it hitting the ground. I didn't know, Tom said. His voice was shattered. Ronan, I swear, I didn't know about Daniel. I didn't know he was going to... I thought it was just money, just the financial stuff. Stokes told me it was a business arrangement. He told me nobody would get hurt. People got hurt, Tom. I know. 13 families. I know. And Daniel Mercer is dead. A 37-year-old man with a wife and a daughter, dead. And his last journal entry says he was getting sick. Stomach problems. Headaches. 2 weeks before his heart gave out. Ronan paused. Did you know about that? No. The word came out like a wound. No, I didn't know. I didn't... Ronan, when Daniel died, I stopped. That's when I left the club. That's why I left. Because when he died, I knew something was wrong and I couldn't sit at that table anymore. I couldn't look at you. I couldn't look at any of you. So you ran. I ran. Yes. I ran because I was a coward. and because I was afraid, and because I thought if I just disappeared, it would stop, that Stokes would move on, that nobody would ever find out. And the families, the widows, the elderly people who lost everything because you gave Stokes their information? Tom didn't answer. The crying had stopped, replaced by a breathing so ragged it sounded like a man drowning on dry land. Ronan held the phone against his ear and listened to it, and he felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, not the brotherhood bond that had connected them for 9 years. Nothing. Just the cold, clear recognition that the man on the other end of this call had made a choice, and the consequences of that choice had spread like poison through every life it touched. "I'm going to ask you one question," Ronan said, "and your answer determines what happens next. Not to me, not to the club, to a 9-year-old girl who is sleeping in our back room right now because the man you worked for has been threatening to take her from her mother." He heard Tom's breath catch. "Did Gregory Stokes kill Daniel Mercer?" The pause lasted 5 seconds. "I don't know for certain," Tom whispered. "But 2 weeks before Daniel died, Stokes told me he'd handled the problem." Those were his words. Handled the problem. I asked what he meant. He told me not to ask again. Another breath. 3 days later, Daniel started getting sick, and 10 days after that, he was dead. Ronan closed his eyes. He stood in the workshop of the Iron Haven clubhouse at 2:31 in the morning with a phone pressed to his ear and a dead man's journal on the table, and the full, unvarnished weight of what had happened settling onto his shoulders like a load that would never come off. Daniel Mercer had been murdered, not by violence, not by a weapon that left marks, but by a man who had learned over years of practice how to eliminate threats without leaving evidence. Poison. Something slow, something that mimicked natural causes, something that a routine autopsy wouldn't catch because nobody had been looking for it. And the doorway that Stokes had used to find Daniel, the connection that led him to the Mercer family in the first place, was the Iron Haven Motorcycle Club. Their outreach, their charity, their goodwill. Weaponized. "Tom," Ronan's voice was emptied of everything. No warmth, no threat, no emotion at all, just words. "You're going to come to the clubhouse tomorrow. You're going to sit at the table and you're going to tell the brothers everything, every name, every transaction, every conversation you had with Stokes. And then you're going to help us bury him." "They'll kill me." "Maybe. But you'll deserve to be in the room when this ends. And that little girl deserves to hear the truth from the mouth of the man who helped destroy her family." "Ronan, tomorrow, Tom, or I come find you, and that conversation will be different." He hung up. The phone went dark. The workshop was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent light and the distant rattle of the space heater and the sound of Ronan's own breathing, which was steady and even and completely at odds with the devastation happening inside his chest. He walked out of the workshop and down the hallway. The backroom door was open a crack, and through the gap he could see Emma asleep on one of the cots with her arm over Lila, the girl curled against her mother's side with her broken backpack clutched to her chest, even in sleep. The space heater glowed orange in the corner, casting a warm light that made the room look almost safe. Almost. Ronan pulled the door shut and stood in the hallway. He put his back against the wall and slid down until he was sitting on the cold floor with his knees up and his forearms resting on them and his head bowed. He thought about Porter, about Vasquez, about the 4 or 5 families who had come through the club's charity work and ended up in Gregory Stokes' crosshairs because Tom Kinney had fed their names into a machine designed to consume them. He thought about Daniel Mercer getting sick at his job site, feeling his body betray him and not understanding why. Writing in his journal with hands that were already weakening. Hiding a box in a heating vent because he knew he was dying and didn't know if anyone would ever find it. He thought about the little girl in the back room who had walked through the dark because a neighbor told her that dangerous men sometimes do good things. And he thought about what it meant that the good things they'd done had been turned into weapons. That every toy run and car repair and holiday meal had been, for at least one man at their table, a scouting mission. A menu of targets. A list of people who were vulnerable enough to be destroyed. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was foundational. It reached into the core of what the Iron Haven was supposed to be and corroded it from the inside, and Ronan understood, sitting on that cold floor in that dark hallway, that when Tom Kinney walked through the clubhouse door tomorrow, everything would change. The brotherhood would fracture, the trust would shatter, and the men who had agreed to protect Lila and Emma would have to decide whether the club they'd built was worth saving or whether the rot went too deep. He heard footsteps. Quiet. Deliberate. Maddox appeared at the end of the hallway, a cigarette behind his ear, his face half lit by the glow from the main room. "You look like hell," Maddox said. "Feel like it too." Maddox leaned against the opposite wall. He didn't sit. He stood the way he always stood. Ready, balanced, weight on the balls of his feet, eyes scanning even when there was nothing to scan. The habits of a man who had spent years in positions where relaxation could get you killed. "Sawyer told me about the journal, about Victor being someone else." "There's more." Maddox waited. Ronan told him about Kinney, told him about the financial routing, the information pipeline, the connection to the club's charity work, told him about Daniel's last journal entry and the conversation he'd just had on the phone. He told it flat, without emphasis, without emotion, the way field reports are delivered when the information is too heavy for inflection. When he finished, Maddox was still standing. His face hadn't changed, his posture hadn't shifted, but his hands, which had been at his sides, were now clenched into fists so tight that the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. "Kinney was in the room," Maddox said quietly. "When we voted on the outreach programs, when we planned the toy runs, when we sat at that table and talked about protecting people." He paused. "He sat at our table." "Yes." "And he fed those people to a murderer." "Yes." Maddox unclenched his fists, then clenched them again, then unclenched them. The cycle repeated 3 times, and Ronan watched it because he recognized it. The physical mechanism of a man deciding whether to break something or build something, and the decision wasn't obvious. "What's the play?" Maddox asked. "Kinney comes in tomorrow. He tells us everything. We use his testimony plus Daniel's journal plus Briggs's research to build a package that's airtight. Not suggestive, not circumstantial, but undeniable. Then we deliver it. To who? The cops who gave Emma a pamphlet. To someone higher, state level. Someone who handles fraud and racketeering and doesn't answer to the same local system that Stokes has been operating under." "And Stokes? What stops him from running when he realizes the evidence is out?" Ronan looked at Maddox. In the dim hallway light, his face was all angles and shadows, the scar on his jaw a dark line, his eyes reflecting the faint orange glow from the crack beneath the backroom door. "We don't let him realize it. We let him think he's winning. We let him think Emma is alone and broken and ready to sign whatever he puts in front of her. We let him walk into a room where he thinks he has all the power, and we let him say the things he says when he thinks no one is listening. A trap. A stage. With cameras and microphones and witnesses. And when he performs, when he admits what he's done because he can't resist telling a terrified woman how thoroughly he's beaten her, we let the curtain drop." Maddox stared at him for a long time. In the silence, the space heater clicked off in the back room, and for a moment the hallway was perfectly quiet. No hum, no rattle, no sound except 2 men breathing in the dark. "That's a dangerous play," Maddox said. "Every play is dangerous. If he brings muscle, if he suspects anything, if Kinney tips him off before tomorrow." "Kinney won't tip him off." "How do you know?" "Because Kinney knows that Stokes killed Daniel Mercer. And for all his failures, for everything he did wrong, Tom Kinney is still a man who knows the difference between a thief and a murderer. He crossed one line. He won't cross the other." Maddox said nothing. He reached behind his ear and pulled the cigarette out, looked at it, then put it back. A decision deferred, a habit maintained. "I'll build the surveillance setup," he said finally. "Camera placement, audio, live feed. If we're doing this, we do it right. No gaps, no dead angles, every word recorded." "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Maddox pushed off the wall. His eyes found Ronan's one more time. "Thank that little girl who walked through the dark. Because without her, Stokes would have finished the job and moved on to family number 14, and none of us would have known that our own brother helped him do it." He walked away down the hallway, his boots silent on the floor, his shadow stretching and shrinking under the uneven light. Ronan sat on the cold floor and listened to the silence. Behind the door, Lila shifted in her sleep. The cot creaked. Emma murmured something. A name, maybe Daniel's, maybe not. and then went quiet again. In 12 hours, Tom Kinney would walk through the clubhouse door, and the Brotherhood would learn what had been done in their name. And after that, nothing would be the same. Not the club, not the table, not the code, not the belief, held by every man who wore the patch, that the worst threats came from outside. The worst threat had been sitting at their table for 9 years, and the only reason they knew about it now was because a man they'd never met had hidden a metal box inside a heating vent, and a 9-year-old girl had been brave enough to walk through a door that no child should ever have to walk through. Ronan closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. He sat in the dark hallway with his back against the wall and his boots on the cold floor, and he waited for morning the way soldiers wait for morning, not with hope, not with dread, but with the grim, absolute certainty that whatever was coming, there was no turning back from it now. The evidence was on the table. The traitor was coming home. And somewhere across the city, Gregory Stokes was sleeping in a bed paid for with stolen money, dreaming whatever dreams men like him dream, not yet knowing that the wall he'd spent 20 years building was about to collapse. Not from the outside, not from police or prosecutors or the slow grinding machinery of justice, but from a dead man's journal and a broken brotherhood and a little girl who refused to disappear. Morning came gray and cold and without mercy. And with it, everything changed. Tom Kinney arrived at 9:14 in the morning, driving a truck that hadn't been washed in months with plates from the eastern county and a face that looked like it had been carved from the inside out by something no amount of sleep would fix. He parked at the edge of the lot, away from the row of Harleys, and sat behind the wheel for a full 2 minutes before he opened the door. Ronan watched from the clubhouse window. Sawyer stood behind him, arms crossed, jaw locked, radiating the particular kind of fury that doesn't explode. It compresses, goes inward, turns into something harder than bone. "If he runs," Sawyer said, "he won't run. If he runs, I'm going after him." "He won't run, Sawyer. Look at him." Sawyer looked. Kinney was out of the truck now, standing next to it with his hands in his jacket pockets and his head down, staring at the asphalt. He looked like a man walking to his own execution who had decided not to fight it. His hair was longer than any of them remembered, streaked with gray that hadn't been there 18 months ago, and he'd lost weight. The kind of weight loss that comes not from exercise but from the systematic erosion of a man who has stopped eating, because eating requires the belief that tomorrow is worth showing up for. He walked to the front door. He didn't knock. He stood outside it with his hand raised and his fist closed, and he waited, and Ronan understood that Kinney was giving them the choice, letting them decide whether the door opened or stayed shut, whether the Brotherhood extended one final gesture to a man who had betrayed it, or whether it sealed itself against him forever. Ronan opened the door. Kinney looked at him. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles so deep they looked like bruises. He smelled like stale coffee and unwashed clothes and the sour, metallic scent of fear, real fear, the kind that lives in the body for months and changes the chemistry of a man's sweat. "Ronan, come in." The main room had been cleared. No cards on the tables, no parts catalogs, no scattered coffee mugs. Just the long table at the center, and around it the officers of the Iron Haven, Sawyer, Briggs, Dutton, Maddox. Emma had been moved to the workshop with Lila. The door closed, Briggs's laptop playing a movie at low volume so the girl wouldn't hear what was about to happen in the next room. Kinney walked in, and the door closed behind him, and he stood at the end of the table like a defendant waiting for a verdict that had already been decided. Nobody offered him a chair. "Sit down," Ronan said. Kinney sat. His hands were on the table, palms down, fingers slightly apart. They were trembling. Ronan placed Daniel Mercer's journal in the center of the table. He opened it to the page where Kinney's name was circled 3 times. He didn't say anything. He let the page speak. Kinney looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed his eyes. "Tell them," Ronan said. And Tom Kinney told them everything. It had started 4 years ago. Kinney was drowning. The divorce, the debt, the VA disability payments that covered half his rent, and none of his shame. He'd been drinking, not club drinking, not the kind of drinking men did after a ride when the night was long and the road had been good. Drinking alone, in the dark. The kind that turns off the parts of a man's brain that remind him he used to be something. Stokes had found him at a bar in the eastern county, had bought him a drink, then another, then started talking about opportunities. Easy money, nothing violent, just information, names, addresses, financial situations, people who were struggling, people who were alone, people who wouldn't fight back. Kinney had said no, the first time, the second time, the third time. But the fourth time, Stokes had put an envelope on the bar with $5,000 in it and said, "You don't have to do anything wrong. You just have to tell me who needs help. I'll be the one who helps them." Kinney took the money, and then he couldn't stop. He fed Stokes information from the club's outreach work, the families they visited, the women whose cars they fixed, the elderly who showed up to holiday meals alone. He told himself it wasn't hurting anyone. He told himself Stokes was just a businessman. He told himself the families would be fine. They weren't fine. The first lawsuit came 6 months later. A widow in Branton who had been visited by the Iron Haven during a toy run. Stokes targeted her with forged debt documents, and she signed over her house because she didn't know she had any other option. When Kinney saw the news, he threw up in the parking lot of the bar where Stokes had first approached him. He went home and sat on the floor of his kitchen and stared at the wall for 7 hours. Then he went back. Because by then, Stokes had records, texts, bank transfers, enough to prove that Kinney had been paid for the information. If Kinney stopped, Stokes would send the records to the club, to the police, to the VA. Kinney's disability benefits, his freedom, his last connection to the men who had kept him alive through 2 deployments, all of it would be gone. So he kept going. 3 more families, then 5, then 10. Each one a name he'd heard at the club table. Each one a person who had trusted the Iron Haven. Each one destroyed by a man who used that trust as a weapon. When Daniel Mercer died, something broke in Kinney that couldn't be repaired. He didn't know for certain that Stokes had killed him, but he knew Daniel had been investigating. He knew Stokes had mentioned handling the problem. And he knew that a healthy 37-year-old man had suddenly started getting sick and then died. And the timing was too precise to be coincidence. He left the club. He left the county. He stopped answering calls because he couldn't hear the voices of men who trusted him without feeling the physical sensation of something inside his chest collapsing. He'd been waiting 18 months for this moment, for the phone call, for the reckoning. And now it was here. When Kinney finished, the room was silent for 30 seconds. 30 seconds is an eternity when 5 men are sitting in a room with a traitor, and the only thing between violence and restraint is the decision of the man at the head of the table. Sawyer broke first. Not with words. He pushed back his chair, stood, and walked to the wall. He put both hands flat against it and pressed his forehead to the surface between them, and he stood like that, a 6'4" man bracing himself against a wall because the wall was the only thing keeping him from crossing the room. Dutton didn't move, didn't blink. He sat with his arms crossed and his face empty and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the room, beyond the building, beyond anything that existed in the physical world. Maddox stared at Kinney with an expression that wasn't anger or contempt. It was assessment. The cold mathematical evaluation of a man who had spent years determining threat levels through a scope and who was now applying that same calculus to the human being sitting 6 feet away. Briggs took off his glasses and set them on the table and said nothing at all. Ronan let the silence do its work. He let it press down on the room and fill every corner and settle into every crack until there was nowhere left for it to go. Then he spoke. "Here's what happens now. Tom stays. He doesn't leave this building. He cooperates fully. Names, dates, bank accounts, everything Stokes ever told him, every transaction, every contact. Briggs compiles it with Daniel's journal and the existing research into a single package." He paused. "And then we end this." "How?" Dutton asked. The first word he'd spoken in 20 minutes. "Stokes thinks he's winning. He thinks Emma is about to break. His lawyer called me at 5 in the morning trying to recover his assets. That means Stokes is impatient. He wants to close this, get Emma's signature, take control of Lila, lock it down before anyone starts asking questions." Ronan leaned forward. "So we give him what he wants. We give him Emma." Every head in the room turned. "Not for real," Ronan said. "We set a meeting. Emma agrees to sign. We pick a location we control, wire it. Cameras, audio, everything. Maddox handles the technical setup. We let Stokes walk in, sit down, and do what he always does. We let him explain. We let him gloat. We let him say out loud what he's been doing in the dark for 20 years. And then? Sawyer asked from the wall without turning around. And then we hand the recording, the journal, Kinney's testimony, and Briggs's research to state investigators. Not local police, not a precinct officer with a pamphlet, state level, the kind of people who handle organized fraud and murder investigations. Murder, Dutton repeated. The word landed on the table like a dropped blade. Daniel Mercer. If Stokes did what we think he did, the evidence package gives investigators enough to reopen the death as suspicious. Toxicology retest. Full forensic review. The room absorbed this. It absorbed it the way concrete absorbs rain. Slowly, reluctantly, holding everything on the surface until it had no choice but to let it through. And if Stokes doesn't talk, Maddox asked, if he walks in with his lawyer and keeps his mouth shut and just slides papers across the table? He won't keep his mouth shut. Men like Stokes can't. They've been getting away with it for so long that the getting away is the drug. He doesn't just want Emma to sign. He wants her to know she lost. He wants her to feel it. He'll talk. You're betting everything on his ego. I'm betting everything on the same thing that made him call his lawyer at 5 a.m. to threaten a man he's never met. Control. He needs to demonstrate control. And when a man like that walks into a room where he thinks he has total control, he performs. Maddox nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement. The nod of a man who understood the mathematics of the bet, even if he didn't love the odds. The next 8 hours were the most focused the Iron Haven had ever spent on anything that didn't involve an engine. Maddox set up the surveillance equipment. 2 pinhole cameras, one in the overhead light fixture, one behind a wall clock, and 3 wireless microphones. He tested each one 4 times. The live feed ran to a laptop in the workshop, monitored by Briggs, who would be recording everything on 2 separate drives because redundancy wasn't paranoia, it was professionalism. Dutton handled communication with the state investigator's office. It took 3 calls. The first 2 were met with skepticism. A motorcycle club reporting organized fraud wasn't exactly standard procedure. But the 3rd call reached an assistant district attorney named Marquez, who had been tracking sealed settlement patterns in the county for 2 years and who, when she heard the name Gregory Stokes, went very quiet for a very long time. She agreed to have investigators standing by within a 3-block radius during the meeting, ready to move on Ronan's signal. Sawyer handled security. He positioned 2 club members on the surrounding streets with clear sightlines to the building entrance. 2 more inside the clubhouse and the workshop with Emma and Lila. Nobody was getting to that back room without going through 4 men who had collectively survived 7 combat deployments and had absolutely no interest in letting anyone pass. And Ronan handled Emma. He found her in the workshop, sitting on the floor with Lila asleep on the cot behind her. The girl had her arms wrapped around the purple backpack even in sleep, and Emma was watching her with the expression of a mother who has been told she might lose her child and who has decided, with the terrible clarity of desperation, that she will do whatever it takes to prevent it. "We found the man who helped Victor," Ronan said. He sat on an overturned crate across from her. "He's here. He's talking. And we know who Victor really is," he told her. "Not everything. Not Kinney's connection to the club, not yet. But the essential truth. Victor's real name, the 20-year pattern, the 13 families, the evidence in Daniel's journal." And then he told her about Daniel's last entry, about the illness, about what they believed Stokes had done. Emma didn't cry. She sat on the floor of that workshop with her daughter sleeping behind her, and she received the information that her husband had likely been murdered with a stillness so complete it was almost geological. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She processed it the way bedrock processes an earthquake, absorbing the force, holding position, cracking only in the places that were invisible from the surface. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, controlled, empty of everything except purpose. "What do you need from me? I need you to sit in a room with him. I need you to let him think he's won. I need you to let him talk. And then? And then he never touches you or Lila again." Emma looked at her daughter. The girl's breathing was steady, rhythmic, the breathing of a child who had finally found a place safe enough to sleep deeply. The purple backpack rose and fell with each exhale. "I'll do it," Emma said. "Emma?" "I said I'll do it." She turned back to him. Her eyes were dry and hard and lit with something Ronan had seen in soldiers who had been pushed past their limit and discovered, on the other side, a version of themselves that was made entirely of purpose. "He killed my husband. He terrorized my daughter. He stole my life and tried to steal my child. I will sit in that room and I will look at his face and I will let him say whatever he needs to say. And when it's over, I want to be the one who tells him it's finished." Ronan looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. The call to Holloway was placed at 6 p.m. Ronan used Emma's phone. The conversation was brief. "Ms. Mercer is ready to discuss terms. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. She'll meet Mr. Mercer at her attorney's suggestion, a neutral location." He gave the address of a rented office space 2 blocks from the clubhouse, chosen because it was close enough for the club to respond in minutes, and far enough that Stokes wouldn't immediately associate it with the Iron Haven. Holloway paused. "My client will want assurances that Ms. Mercer will come alone." "She'll be alone." "And she's prepared to sign." "She's prepared to discuss signing. She has conditions." "Conditions?" Holloway's voice carried the thin smile of a man who had heard this before, the last desperate negotiation of a person who had already lost and didn't know it yet. "I'll relay the message." The line went dead. Ronan set the phone down. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. But beneath his ribs, his heart was running at the pace of a man who had just committed every person he cared about to a single moment that would either save them or destroy them, and there was no middle ground. Night came. The clubhouse went quiet. Maddox ran final checks on the surveillance equipment at the rented office. Dutton confirmed with Marquez that the state investigators would be in position by 9:30 a.m. Briggs finished compiling the evidence package. A folder 3 inches thick containing Daniel's journal pages, bank records, shell company filings, Kinney's written statement, and the 13 sealed settlement records he'd managed to partially unseal through a contact at the county clerk's office. Tom Kinney sat alone in the corner of the main room. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody looked at him. He sat with his hands on his knees and his head bowed, and he breathed the way men breathe when they are waiting for something that is both necessary and annihilating. At 2 a.m., Ronan walked the perimeter of the clubhouse. The night was black and cold, the wind carrying the faint smell of diesel from the highway and the sharper scent of frost forming on metal. The Harleys in the lot were covered in a thin layer of moisture, their chrome dulled to pewter under the cloud cover. He stopped at the edge of the lot and looked east toward the city. Somewhere out there, Gregory Stokes was sleeping, or not sleeping, preparing, selecting his clothes, rehearsing his lines, imagining tomorrow's conversation the way a director imagines a scene. Blocking, dialogue, the moment when the camera pushes in and the audience sees the protagonist surrender. Stokes thought he was the director. Tomorrow, he would discover he was the audience. Morning arrived at 6:15 with a gray light that crept through the clubhouse windows like something apologetic. Ronan hadn't slept. He'd spent the last 4 hours sitting in the main room with a cold cup of coffee and Daniel Mercer's journal, reading and rereading the entries, memorizing the details, building the architecture of the case in his mind the way a medic builds triage protocols, systematic, prioritized, designed to save what can be saved. By 8 o'clock, everyone was in position. Maddox was at the rented office, running the final camera check, the live feed streaming cleanly to Briggs's laptop back at the clubhouse. The office was sparse. A desk, 2 chairs, a window with blinds drawn. Nothing that would suggest preparation, nothing that would trigger suspicion in a man as meticulous as Stokes. Dutton confirmed the state investigators were parked in an unmarked van 2 blocks north. Marquez was with them. She had a warrant application ready for a judge's emergency signature, contingent on the recorded confession. Sawyer was in the clubhouse with 2 members guarding Emma and Lila. The girl knew something was happening. She could feel it in the way the men moved, the way conversation stopped when she entered a room, the way her mother's face had changed overnight from frightened to something harder and more frightening. But nobody told her what was coming. Nobody told her that in 2 hours her mother would sit across from the man who had murdered her father and pretend to surrender. At 9:15, Ronan drove Emma to the office in Dutton's sedan. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap and her face turned toward the window, and she didn't speak for the entire drive. She was wearing the same clothes she'd worn when she arrived at the clubhouse. A gray sweater, dark jeans, boots that were worn at the heels. No makeup, no effort to appear anything other than what Stokes expected her to be. A woman who had been broken. They arrived at 9:32. Ronan walked her to the door. "I'll be in the next room," he said, 30 feet away. "If anything goes wrong, anything at all, I'm through that wall." Emma looked at him. Her face was calm, not the calm of peace, the calm of a woman who had gone past fear and arrived at a place where fear couldn't reach her because she had already lost the worst thing she could lose and survived it. "He killed Daniel," she said. Not a question, a statement. The foundation she was standing on. Yes. She walked inside. At 9:58, a black Lincoln pulled into the parking lot. Tinted windows, driver stayed behind the wheel. The rear door opened and Gregory Stokes stepped out, wearing a charcoal suit and a navy tie, and an expression of composed patience that had been perfected over 20 years of walking into rooms where people he'd destroyed were waiting to give him what he wanted. Behind him, Holloway emerged from the passenger side, shorter, thinner, carrying a leather briefcase and the particular energy of a man who had done this enough times to find it routine. They entered the building at 10:01. Ronan was in the adjacent room, watching the live feed on Maddox's equipment. He could see the office from two angles, the overhead camera catching the full room, the wall camera focused on the desk. Emma was seated on the far side. Her hands were on the table. She was still. Stokes entered the office with Holloway behind him. He paused at the threshold, a practiced pause, the kind that allows a man to fill a doorway and be seen filling it. He looked at Emma the way a collector looks at an acquisition. "Emma." His voice was warm. That was the worst part, the warmth. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Emma said nothing. Stokes sat across from her. Holloway placed the briefcase on the desk and opened it, removing a stack of documents, the forged contracts, the fabricated debt agreements, the transfer papers. He arranged them on the table with the mechanical precision of a man who had arranged the same documents in front of 13 other people in 13 other rooms. "I want you to know," Stokes said, leaning forward, "that this isn't personal. Your husband made commitments. He took on obligations. I'm simply here to ensure those obligations are honored." Emma stared at him. "I understand this has been difficult. Losing Daniel was devastating for all of us. He was my brother, after all." Stokes folded his hands on the table. His fingers were manicured. His cufflinks caught the overhead light. "But family debts are family debts, and I've been more than patient." "Patient?" Emma repeated. The word came out flat, empty. "Extremely patient. Most creditors would have pursued legal action months ago. I've given you time, space, opportunities to come to a reasonable arrangement." He gestured to the documents. "These papers simply formalize what we've already discussed. You sign the property transfer, the guardianship adjustment, and the repayment schedule, and we can move forward." "Guardianship adjustment," Emma said. "A formality. Temporary shared custody of Lila to ensure the family's interests are properly aligned during the repayment period." In the next room, Ronan's hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard the wood creaked. He could feel Maddox beside him, equally still, equally rigid, both men watching a predator sit across from a woman and explain with perfect composure that he intended to take her daughter. Emma looked at the documents. She didn't touch them. She looked at them the way a person looks at a weapon, not with fear, but with the clear-eyed recognition of what they were designed to do. "Before I sign anything," she said, "I want to understand something." "Of course." "Why Daniel? Why us? You have money. You have lawyers. You could go after anyone. Why a contractor and his family?" Stokes smiled. It was a real smile. Not performed, not calculated, but genuine. The smile of a man who had been asked to explain the thing he was most proud of and couldn't resist the invitation. "Because it's easy," he said. "Your husband was a good man, Emma. Good men are predictable. They work hard. They keep records. They trust the system. And when the system fails them, they don't know what to do. They freeze." He leaned back in his chair. Daniel froze. He found out what I was doing with the company finances, and instead of going to the police, which would have ended this immediately, He started a journal. He gathered evidence. He built a case, like a good, decent man, and good, decent men always take too long. In the next room, Ronan felt something shift inside his chest. Not surprise. He'd expected this. But hearing it out loud, hearing Stokes describe the murder of a good man as a matter of efficiency, was different from knowing it. It was the difference between reading about a wound and feeling the blade. Too long, Emma repeated. By the time he was ready to act, I was already ahead of him. I knew he had evidence, I knew where he was keeping it, and I knew that if Daniel Mercer went to the police, 20 years of work would disappear. Stokes examined his cufflinks. Adjusted one. So I made sure he didn't go to the police. The room went very still. What does that mean? Emma asked. Her voice didn't waver, not by a fraction. It means I handled the situation, Emma. The way I've always handled situations. Quietly, completely, without leaving anything behind. He looked at her. Your husband was going to destroy me, so I removed the threat, and then I came for what was left. In the adjacent room, Maddox exhaled through his teeth. His hand was already on his phone, the text to Marquez pre-typed, his thumb hovering over send. Ronan nodded once. Maddox pressed send. 2 blocks north, a van door opened. Back in the office, Stokes was still talking. The drug was working. The drug of control, of performance, of telling a broken woman exactly how thoroughly he had beaten her. He couldn't stop. He was describing the shell companies, the financial routing, the way he'd placed informants in the buildings where his targets lived. He was explaining how the sealed settlements worked, how the lawyers were paid, how the judges never questioned the paperwork because the paperwork was perfect. He was confessing to 20 years of fraud, coercion, and murder. And every word was being recorded from 2 angles with crystal clear audio. Emma sat through it. She sat through every word. Her hands stayed flat on the table, and her breathing stayed even, and her eyes stayed locked on the face of the man who had killed her husband and tried to steal her daughter. And she didn't flinch. Not once. Not a single time. And then she heard it. The sound that Gregory Stokes had never heard before, because in 20 years of walking into rooms and taking what he wanted, nobody had ever been powerful enough or brave enough or broken enough to arrange what was about to happen. Motorcycles. The rumble started low like thunder rolling across flat ground. 1 engine, then 2, then 4, then more. A wall of sound that built and built until it filled the parking lot outside like a living thing, vibrating through the walls, shaking the blinds, rattling the documents on the desk. Stokes stopped talking. For the first time since he'd walked into the room, something moved across his face that wasn't confidence. It was small, barely perceptible. A flicker in the eyes, a tightening at the corner of the mouth. The micro-expression of a man who has just realized that the room he's standing in is not the room he thought it was. What is that? Holloway asked, half rising from his chair. The front door opened. Ronan walked in first. Behind him, Sawyer. Behind Sawyer, Maddox. Behind Maddox, Dutton. 4 men in leather, filling the doorway, their faces carved from exhaustion and rage, and the absolute unshakable certainty of men who have spent 3 days preparing for this exact moment. Ronan was carrying a folder, 3 inches thick. He set it on the desk in front of Stokes, directly on top of the forged documents. Gregory Allen Stokes, Ronan said, born 1965, Allentown, Pennsylvania. 3 counts of fraud in 2007, charges dropped when you disappeared. 13 sealed settlements in this state under the name Victor Mercer. 1 construction company stolen through forged transfer documents. And 1 man, Daniel Mercer, age 37, dead under circumstances that his own journal describes as deliberate. Stokes stared at the folder. The color drained from his face in stages, not all at once, but slowly, like water receding from a shore. His hands, which had been folded on the table with such composure moments ago, separated and went flat against the wood, palms down, fingers spread, as if he was trying to hold himself to the surface of the earth. This is a setup, Holloway said, his voice rising. This is entrapment. Anything said in this room was recorded with full audio and video, Maddox said from the doorway. 2 cameras, 3 microphones, and a live feed to the state assistant district attorney, who is currently walking across the parking lot with a warrant. Holloway's briefcase hit the floor. He took 3 steps backward, distancing himself from Stokes with the instinctive self-preservation of a man who had just realized that the client he'd been representing for 4 years was not a creditor, but a murderer, and that every document he'd filed bore his signature. "I want a lawyer," Stokes said. "You have one," Ronan said, nodding at Holloway, "although I'm guessing he's about to reconsider." The front door opened again. 3 plainclothes investigators entered, badges visible, followed by Marquez, a compact woman in her 40s with short hair and the particular expression of a prosecutor who has been chasing a case for 2 years and has just watched it walk into a room and confess on camera. "Gregory Stokes," Marquez said, "you are being detained for questioning in connection with financial fraud, identity forgery, coercion, and the suspicious death of Daniel Mercer. You have the right." Stokes slammed both hands on the desk and stood. His chair flew backward. His face had gone from pale to red, the composure shattered, the mask ripped away. And underneath it was the face of a man who had spent 20 years controlling every room he entered and who was now standing in a room that had been built specifically to destroy him. "You think this matters?" he shouted. His voice cracked. The warmth was gone. The performance was over. What remained was raw and ugly and desperate. "You think a journal and some recordings will hold up? I have lawyers. I have connections. You have nothing," Emma said. She stood, slowly. She placed both hands on the table and she looked at Gregory Stokes with eyes that held no fear, no grief, no desperation, only the clear, burning certainty of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side carrying her daughter in one arm and her husband's truth in the other. "Daniel tried to stop you," she said, "and you killed him for it. You took his company. You terrorized his daughter. You came to my home and told me I owed you my child." Her voice didn't shake. "But you made one mistake. You didn't find the box. You didn't find his journal. And you didn't know that the little girl you threatened would walk through the dark and find the one group of people in this city who would never stop until you were finished." Stokes stared at her. The red in his face drained. The fight left his body the way air leaves a punctured tire. Suddenly, completely, irreversibly. His shoulders dropped. His hands unclenched. He stood in the middle of a room surrounded by bikers and investigators and the woman he had tried to destroy. And for the first time in 20 years, Gregory Stokes had absolutely nothing to say. Marquez stepped forward. The investigators moved in, and outside in the parking lot, the engines idled. 12 Harleys, their chrome dulled by November frost, their riders inside, their sound filling the morning like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Ronan stood by the window and watched them put the handcuffs on. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He watched with the stillness of a man who had spent his whole life carrying weight that wasn't his, and who had just set down one piece of it. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough to feel the difference. His phone buzzed, a text from Sawyer back at the clubhouse. "Lila's asking where her mom is." Ronan looked at Emma, who was standing by the desk, watching the investigators lead Stokes out of the building. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was wet. Not from crying, or maybe from crying. The distinction no longer mattered. She was shaking. The adrenaline that had held her upright for the last 40 minutes was draining out of her body, and she was shaking the way leaves shake when the wind finally stops, and the stillness is worse than the storm. He crossed the room and stood beside her. "Your daughter's asking for you," he said. Emma turned to him. She opened her mouth to speak. Nothing came out. She closed it, pressed her lips together, nodded. And outside, as the black Lincoln was sealed with evidence tape, and Gregory Stokes was placed in the back of an unmarked sedan, and Holloway stood alone on the sidewalk with his empty briefcase and his career in ruins, the engines thundered. One by one, the Iron Haven riders pulling out of the lot, forming a line, the sound building until it echoed off every building on the block. Not a victory lap, not a celebration, a statement. The sound that dangerous men make when they have done a good thing, and the cost of doing it hasn't been calculated yet, because the cost is always calculated later, in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between the engines where the silence lives and the ghosts still walk. Ronan drove Emma back to the clubhouse. Neither of them spoke. The cost was coming. He could feel it, but not yet. The first thing Emma did when she walked through the clubhouse door was kneel on the floor and hold her daughter so tight that Lila made a small sound. Not pain, not surprise, but the involuntary exhale of a child whose body had been bracing for impact for so long that the sudden absence of danger was itself a kind of shock. They stayed like that for 4 minutes. Nobody counted except Ronan, who stood by the window with his back to the room because some moments are not meant to be witnessed by the people who made them possible. He counted because counting was what medics did when they were monitoring a patient's recovery. 4 minutes of uninterrupted contact, 4 minutes of a mother's arms around a child, 4 minutes in which no one knocked on the door, no phone rang, no man in a dark sedan sat watching from a parking lot. 4 minutes of silence that felt like the first silence in 14 months that wasn't hiding something. When Emma finally released her, Lila looked up at her mother's face and said, "You're shaking." "I know. Why?" Emma brushed the hair from Lila's forehead. Her hand was trembling so badly that her fingers caught in the tangles, and she had to use both hands to smooth it down, the second hand steadying the first, a gesture so small and so human that Sawyer, standing in the doorway, had to look at the ceiling. "Because the hard part is over," Emma said. "Is the bad man gone?" "Yes." "Forever?" Emma looked at Ronan. He hadn't turned from the window, but he nodded. A single movement of his head, barely visible, the smallest possible gesture carrying the largest possible weight. "Forever," Emma said. The hours that followed were not triumphant. They were not cinematic. They were the hours that come after a disaster has been survived, when the adrenaline drains out of the body and leaves behind a residue of exhaustion, so profound it feels biological, not tiredness, but transformation. The cellular recognition that the organism has been running on emergency power for days and now must shut down individual systems in order to continue functioning at all. Emma slept. 14 hours. She lay down on the cot in the back room at noon and did not move until 2 a.m. the following day. Lila slept beside her for the first 6 hours, then woke and wandered into the main room, where Briggs was sitting at the table with his laptop and his cold coffee and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Is my mom okay?" Lila asked. Briggs looked at her. He had a daughter somewhere, grown now, living in another state, calling him on holidays with the polite regularity of a woman who loved her father but didn't know how to reach him anymore. He hadn't told anyone in the club about the last conversation they'd had, 3 months ago, when she'd asked him to come for the holidays, and he'd said he would, and they both knew he wouldn't. "Your mom is sleeping," he said. "She's going to be fine." "Are you sure?" "Yeah, kid, I'm sure." Lila sat at the table across from him. She pulled her backpack onto her lap, the same purple backpack with the broken zipper that she'd been carrying since the night she walked through the clubhouse door, and unzipped it carefully, reaching inside with the delicate precision of a child retrieving something precious. She pulled out a photograph, creased, worn at the edges, handled so many times that the image was beginning to fade. A man in a hard hat standing next to a pickup truck, grinning. "That's my dad," she said. Briggs looked at the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. "He looks like a good man," Briggs said, and his voice cracked on the last word, just barely, a fracture so thin that only a child's ears would catch it, and Lila's ears caught it, and she looked at Briggs with an expression that was too old for her face. The expression of a 9-year-old who had learned things about the world that 9-year-olds should never have to learn, and who recognized damage in other people because she carried her own. She put the photograph on the table between them, facing Briggs, as if she was sharing it. They sat like that, in silence, while the clubhouse settled around them. The legal machinery moved faster than anyone expected. Marquez's office filed charges within 72 hours. The evidence package, Daniel's journal, the financial records, Briggs's research, Tom Kinney's written testimony, and the full audio-visual recording of Stokes's confession was delivered to a grand jury, which returned indictments on 14 counts including fraud, coercion, identity forgery, financial exploitation, witness intimidation, and 1 count of second-degree murder pending toxicology re-examination. The toxicology came back 11 days later. Daniel Mercer's body was exhumed and re-examined by a forensic pathologist who found what the original autopsy had missed: trace levels of a compound consistent with chronic low-dose poisoning, administered over a period of approximately 3 weeks. The compound was commercially available, difficult to detect in standard toxicology screens, and metabolized in a way that produced symptoms indistinguishable from cardiac distress. Daniel Mercer had not died of heart failure. He had been murdered by a man who had spent 20 years learning how to kill without leaving fingerprints. The murder charge was upgraded to first degree. Gregory Stokes' attorney, not Holloway, who had resigned from the case within hours of the arrest and was now facing his own investigation for potential complicity, filed motions to suppress the recording, claiming entrapment. The motions were denied. The confession was ruled admissible. The sealed settlements from the 13 prior cases were ordered open by a judge who read the evidence brief and reportedly sat at her desk for 10 minutes in silence before issuing the order. 13 families, 13 victims, 13 people who had lost homes, savings, dignity, and years of their lives to a man who targeted them because they were alone in grieving and had made the mistake of trusting the system. 8 of them were still alive. 5 of them agreed to testify. The trial was set for spring, but the outcome was never in doubt. Stokes' own words, recorded in high-definition audio from 2 angles, played for a jury of 12 people who sat in their chairs and listened to a man describe how he had murdered a 37-year-old father as a matter of business efficiency, ensured that Gregory Allen Stokes was convicted on all counts. The sentence would come later, but the conviction was enough. It was enough for the families. It was enough for the prosecutors. And it was enough for a 9-year-old girl who had walked through the dark to find the one door in the city that would open for her. The aftermath, though. The aftermath was where the real work happened. Tom Kinney testified for the prosecution. He sat in a witness chair and told a courtroom full of strangers every detail of what he had done. The names he'd given Stokes, the money he'd taken, the families he'd fed into a machine designed to destroy them. He told it without self-pity, without excuse, without the defensive posture of a man trying to minimize his role. He told it the way a soldier gives a debrief after a mission gone catastrophically wrong. Factual, sequential, complete. When the prosecutor asked him why he had cooperated, Kinney looked across the courtroom to where the Iron Haven members were sitting in the gallery. Ronan, Sawyer, Briggs, Dutton, Maddox, all of them in a row, leather jackets, faces unreadable, and said, "Because they taught me that the worst thing you can do isn't making a mistake. It's running from it." After the testimony, Kinney walked out of the courthouse and drove to the Eastern County and was not heard from again. Ronan didn't look for him. Some debts couldn't be repaid by finding the person who owed them. Some debts could only be carried by the debtor, alone, for whatever remained of their life. But the Iron Haven had to reckon with what Kinney had done. Not in a courtroom. In the clubhouse. They held church 3 days after the conviction, every patched member, door locked, phones off, the table scarred with burns and initials and the weight of a decade of decisions that had brought them to this moment. Ronan spoke first. Tom Kinney sat at this table for 9 years. He ate with us, rode with us, wore the patch, and he used every piece of trust we gave him to help a man destroy the people we swore to protect. He paused. That's on him, but it's also on us, because we didn't see it. We didn't ask the right questions. We didn't check. We couldn't have known, Dutton said. Maybe not, but we can know going forward. Every outreach contact, every family we work with, protected, verified. No single member handles information alone. 2 sets of eyes on everything. Not because we don't trust each other, but because trust without accountability is how Tom Kinney happened. Sawyer leaned forward. His jaw was tight. It had been tight for weeks. A permanent tension that hadn't relaxed since the morning Kinney's name had surfaced in Daniel's journal. But his voice, when he spoke, was measured, deliberate. The voice of a man who had processed his anger and arrived at something more durable. Porter and Vasquez, Sawyer said. 2 years ago, we said we'd never let something like that happen again, and it happened again. Different shape, different weapon, but the same failure. We didn't protect the people who needed us. He looked around the table. I've got a daughter Lila's age. When that girl walked through our door, I saw my kid. I saw what happens when the world fails a child, and the only thing standing between her and the worst possible outcome is a room full of broken men who decided to give a damn. His voice roughened. That's what this club is. not the bikes, not the patch, not the reputation. It's this: a room full of broken men who decide every single day that being broken isn't an excuse to stop fighting for the people nobody else will fight for. Nobody spoke for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed. The wind pressed against the walls. Somewhere outside, an engine turned over. Not a Harley, just a car, passing on the road beyond the fence, and the sound faded into the distance like a thought that couldn't quite be held. Ronan put his hands on the table, the same table where Porter and Vasquez had once sat, where Kinney had once sat, where every man who had ever worn the Iron Haven patch had put his hands and made his promises and hoped, without ever saying it out loud, that the promises would be enough. "We build it better," Ronan said. "That's all we can do. We build it better." It was Maddox who broke the silence that followed. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. Small, creased, the kind that fit in a wallet. He placed it on the table without explanation. The men looked. It was a picture of a young woman holding an infant, standing in front of a house with peeling paint and a chain-link fence. "My sister," Maddox said, "and my niece. 3 years ago, before I patched in, my sister's landlord ran a scam, forged eviction papers, threatened to take her kid if she reported it. She called the police. They told her it was a civil matter." He paused. The muscle in his jaw ticked. "I handled it. That's why I'm here. That's why I walked through your door and asked for a patch. Because I knew what this club was supposed to be, and I wanted to be part of it." He looked at Ronan. "I gave you a hard time about Lila, about the risk, about Porter and Vasquez." He paused. "I was wrong. Not about the risk. The risk was real, but about the reason. The reason was never about calculating odds. It was about the fact that when a child walks through your door, you don't get to do math. You just get to stand up." The room held the words. They sank into the wood of the table and the leather of the jackets and the bone-deep weariness of men who had been awake for too long, and fighting for too long, and carrying too much for too long, and who were, despite everything, still sitting at the table. Church ended without a vote. No vote was needed. The decision had been made the night a 9-year-old girl walked through the front door and whispered the words that changed everything. The clubhouse was never the same after that. Not worse. Not better. Different. The way a bone is different after it breaks and heals, okay, stronger at the fracture point, but carrying the memory of the break in its structure forever. 3 months after the conviction, Emma opened a bakery. It was small, a corner storefront on Hadley Street, 6 blocks from the clubhouse, with a blue awning and a hand-painted sign that read Mercer's in white letters. The space had been a laundromat before, and it still smelled faintly of detergent when the weather was warm, but Emma had scrubbed the floors and painted the walls a pale yellow and installed second-hand ovens that Dutton and Sawyer had hauled across the city in the back of Dutton's truck, strapping them down with cargo nets and bungee cords, and the kind of creative profanity that men reserve for heavy objects and tight corners. The Iron Haven had helped. Not with money. Emma hadn't asked for money and wouldn't have taken it, but with labor. Sawyer rebuilt the counter from reclaimed wood he'd been storing in the clubhouse garage for 2 years without knowing why. Briggs handled the permits, navigating the city bureaucracy with the same methodical precision he applied to tracing shell companies. Maddox installed the electrical. He'd done wiring in the service, and he did it now the same way, silent and meticulous, every connection tested twice. And Ronan did the one thing he was good at. He showed up every morning, 6:15, before the shop opened. He sat at the small table near the window with a cup of black coffee and the newspaper, and he didn't say much, and Emma didn't need him to say much. He was there. That was the thing. He was there the way a wall is there. Not decorative, not temporary, just present, solid. The kind of presence that a woman who had spent 14 months looking over her shoulder could lean against without worrying that it would move. The other club members came too. Not every day, but regularly. Dutton on Tuesdays, always ordering the same blueberry muffin and leaving a tip that was 3 times the price. Briggs on Thursday mornings, sitting in the corner with his laptop, running whatever searches he ran, his cold coffee growing colder while Emma refilled it without being asked. Sawyer brought his daughter on Saturdays, a girl named Cora, who was 10, and who immediately decided that Lila Mercer was the most interesting person she had ever met, a determination that resulted in the two girls spending every Saturday morning in the back of the bakery, covered in flour, constructing elaborate pastry architectures that bore no resemblance to any known food item. Lila changed. Not overnight, not dramatically. The way seasons change, so slowly that you don't notice until one morning you look out the window and realize the world is different from what it was. She stopped whispering. Not all at once. The first time Ronan heard her speak at full volume was 3 weeks after the bakery opened. She was standing behind the counter. Emma had given her a small apron, comically oversized, the strings wrapped twice around her waist, and a customer had asked what she recommended. "The cinnamon rolls," Lila said, not whispered, said, at a normal volume, with the confident clarity of a girl who had an opinion and saw no reason not to share it. Ronan was sitting at his usual table. He heard it. He didn't react. He turned the page of his newspaper and took a sip of coffee and let the moment exist without marking it, because some victories are too important to be celebrated out loud. They need to be felt, absorbed, allowed to settle into the foundation of a life that was being rebuilt, brick by brick, morning by morning, cinnamon roll by cinnamon roll. The backpack changed too. Lila still carried it, the same purple backpack with the broken zipper, but she carried it differently now. Before, she had clutched it to her chest like a shield. Now she slung it over one shoulder the way kids do when they're walking to school and thinking about something else entirely. The backpack was the same. The girl inside the straps was not. Emma had the zipper fixed. She could have bought a new backpack, but she had the zipper fixed instead, because some things carry their scars and are more valuable for it. The letter was the hardest part, Daniel's sealed envelope, for Emma, if something happens to me, had sat in the lockbox in the clubhouse workshop for weeks. Emma hadn't opened it. She'd known it was there. Ronan had told her, but she'd said, "Not yet," and he'd respected the "not yet," because he understood that some truths need time to be received, and the dead speak on the schedule of the living. She opened it on a Sunday morning in January. The bakery was closed. Lila was at a birthday party, Cora's birthday, at Sawyer's house, where 12 children and 4 bikers were attempting to manage a bounce house that Dutton had rented and Maddox had assembled with the focused intensity of a man defusing an explosive device. Emma sat alone at the bakery counter with the envelope and a cup of tea that she didn't drink. She opened the seal with her thumbnail. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once, covered in Daniel's handwriting. She read it. Ronan found her an hour later, sitting in the same position, the letter on the counter, her face wet, her hands still. He didn't ask what it said. He sat on the stool next to her and he waited. "He knew," Emma said eventually. Her voice was raw, scraped clean, the voice of a woman who had been crying for an hour and had arrived at a place beyond crying. "He knew Victor, Stokes, was going to come for us. He wrote that if he was gone, I shouldn't trust anyone who claimed to be family, that the only debt we owed was to each other, that Lila was the only thing that mattered." She pressed her fingers to the paper, touching the handwriting, touching the ghost of the man who had held the pen. "He said he was sorry, for not telling me sooner, for trying to handle it alone, for being a good, decent man who took too long." She looked at Ronan. Her eyes were red and swollen and absolutely clear. Stokes said that Daniel was a good, decent man who took too long. He said it like it was a weakness, like decency was a flaw. She shook her head. But Daniel's decency is the reason Lila is alive, his journal, his evidence, his refusal to give up even when he was dying. He was decent until the very end, and his decency saved us. Ronan looked at the letter on the counter, at Daniel's handwriting, at the words of a man who had known he was running out of time, and had used the last of it to write a letter to the woman he loved, trying to protect her from across the divide that separated the living from the dead. "He did save you," Ronan said, "from a long way away. That takes more than decency. That takes something I don't have a word for." Emma folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. She placed it inside her apron pocket, close to her body, where it would stay. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not telling me to be strong. For not telling me it would be okay." For not giving me advice or platitudes or any of the things people say when they don't know what to say. She paused. For just sitting here. Ronan looked at his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. That's about all I'm good for, he said. The last scene happened on a Saturday in March. The air had changed. Winter was releasing its grip, slowly, reluctantly, the way it always did in this part of the country. Not with warmth, but with the absence of cruelty. The sky was a pale blue that looked almost accidental, as if the clouds had simply forgotten to show up, and the wind had dropped to a whisper that carried the smell of wet earth and the first suggestion of green. Ronan pulled his Harley into the bakery parking lot at 7 a.m. Emma was already inside, the ovens lit, the first batch of bread rising behind the counter. Through the window, he could see her moving in the warm yellow light, her hair tied back, her sleeves pushed up, flour on her forearms. She was humming. He couldn't hear the melody through the glass, but he could see it in the way she moved, loose, unhurried, the movements of a woman who was not listening for footsteps behind her. He went inside. She poured his coffee without asking. Black, no sugar. She set it on the table by the window where the morning light was beginning to reach, and she said, Lila wants to ride today. Ride? On your motorcycle. She's been asking for weeks. She told Cora that she's going to ride a Harley, and now it's a matter of 9-year-old honor. Ronan looked at his coffee. The parking lot, 15 miles an hour. Helmet. Obviously. And she holds on the entire time. She will. He drank his coffee and watched the morning light move across the table. In an hour, the bakery would open and the regulars would come. Dutton with his blueberry muffin, Briggs with his laptop, the neighborhood people who had started showing up in January and kept coming back because the bread was good, and the woman who baked it remembered their names and their orders and the small details of their lives that most people forgot. At 9 o'clock, Lila arrived. She was wearing jeans and sneakers and a jacket that actually fit. New, bought by Emma with the first month's bakery earnings. Her hair was clean, her eyes were bright. She walked through the door of the bakery the way she had once walked through the door of the clubhouse, with purpose, with certainty, with the unshakable conviction of a child who has decided what she wants and cannot be talked out of it. I'm ready, she announced. Ronan looked at her from his table. He took one more sip of coffee, set it down, stood. All right. They walked to the parking lot. The Harley sat in the morning light, chrome gleaming, the Iron Haven patch on the saddlebag, the blacksmith's anvil wrapped in chain, stitched and restitched, faded and worn and enduring. Ronan pulled a helmet from the saddlebag. It was too big for Lila. He'd bought it 3 days ago because Sawyer had mentioned she'd been asking, and he'd driven to 4 different shops before he found one small enough, and it was still too big. And she put it on and the visor covered half her face, and she grinned at him from underneath it with a grin that was so wide and so uncomplicated and so entirely free of fear that Ronan had to look away for a moment, at the sky, at the pavement, at anything that wasn't a 9-year-old girl smiling at him like he was someone worth smiling at. He got on the bike. She climbed up behind him, small hands gripping his jacket, her sneakers barely reaching the passenger pegs. Emma stood in the bakery doorway, arms crossed, watching with an expression that held everything, fear and trust and grief and gratitude, and the particular complicated love of a mother watching her daughter ride into the world on the back of a machine that belonged to a man who had walked into her apartment one November night and refused to leave until the darkness did. Ronan started the engine. The Harley rumbled to life, low and deep, the vibration traveling through the frame and into his hands and through the small hands gripping his jacket and into the girl behind him who had once whispered because whispering was the only safe volume in a world built to silence her. He rode the parking lot. 15 miles an hour. Slow, wide circles, the engine barely above idle, the morning sun throwing their shadow long and clean across the asphalt. And Lila laughed. She laughed the way children laugh when they have been given back something that was stolen from them. Not politeness, not performance, but the raw, uncontained explosion of joy that belongs to a child who has discovered that the world is bigger and louder and more beautiful than the small, dark room she was kept in. She laughed, and the sound carried across the parking lot and through the open door of the bakery and into the street where the morning traffic moved and the city woke and the sky held its pale blue, and the wind carried its whisper of green. Ronan rode in circles and listened to a child laugh, and did not consider himself anyone's hero. He was a man with scars and nightmares, and a clubhouse that smelled like motor oil. He was a man who had lost brothers and failed to save people, and carried the weight of every failure in a place behind his ribs that never stopped aching. But every time Lila introduced him to someone, to Cora's friends, to the bakery customers, to the other parents at school pickup, she said the same thing. "This is the biker who proved I never owed anyone my childhood." And every time she said it, Ronan understood something that no war and no road and no amount of darkness had been able to teach him. That the greatest battles are not fought with fists or engines or the kind of violence that leaves marks on skin. They are fought by standing in a doorway at 4 a.m. and telling a frightened woman that her daughter is safe. By sitting at a table in a bakery at 6:15 with a cup of cold coffee and the newspaper. By riding 15 miles an hour in a parking lot, while a 9-year-old girl holds onto your jacket and laughs louder than she ever thought possible. By being the door that opens when every other door has closed. The engine idled, the sun climbed, the shadow shortened, and in the doorway of a bakery on Hadley Street, a woman who had lost everything stood watching her daughter ride in circles, alive and laughing. And for the first time in 14 months, Emma Mercer did not look over her shoulder. There was no one behind her. There was no one coming. There was only the sound of an engine and the sound of a child and the sound of a morning that, for once, had nothing to hide.